Was done last summer. Is there more to come?
Yes, thank you for the question. The wayfinding strategy has received quite a bit of attention. I think things look really great. I'm actually going to ask Guylaine to comment on that, as she's been a very integral part of this process as the visitor experience manager.
For sure, yeah. So we are still in phase one. We were hoping to have a lot more signs up for the summer, so this spring. It's been delayed a little bit due to just little delays happened, and then we're hoping to see more signs coming up probably late summer, early fall. So yeah, that's very exciting, and it's going to look very good actually.
And may I continue, Your Worship?
Go ahead. One more question, Councillor Elliott. Another councillor has a question as well.
Yeah, just targeting. I mean, the COVID thing's a bit of a mess for everybody, but are you trying to indicate some recovery midsummer, or is trying to ramp up or be prepared for midsummer rush? Is that your hope?
Yes, definitely. Of course, with visitation up in the air, we're trying to stay light on our feet, just like every other business, definitely. Yeah. We're actually just analyzing the data from our latest survey that just closed at the end of April. And we are seeing that, you know, workforce is definitely a concern for our businesses, especially some businesses have had to continue to lay off staff. So, you know, we're definitely aware of a lot of those bottlenecks and challenges, and, you know, a lot of them aren't easy fixes, that's for sure. But, you know, we're waiting to see what happens with visitation, and that will define what the summer looks like.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Charlotte.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd noticed Ingrid Braun had her hand up as well. I don't know if she wanted to contribute to that conversation or.
Ingrid, do you want to add something before we go on?
I was just going to jump in and say that, through Your Worship, yes, the wayfinding project is actually being implemented by the Department of Engineering and Public Works, and they may be able to answer questions about where we are with phase 1 signage. And yeah, it's been done in collaboration with tourism, and it's really exciting. And yeah, that's all. I thought you might have some more specific questions about the stages of wayfinding that you could ask engineering.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Ms. Braun. Councillor Charlotte.
Great. Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to the Chamber of Commerce for coming and presenting both sides of their work. I think it's interesting to look at that separation between visitor services and how that's now evolving as separate from the marketing role that tourism is taking on. That's really neat to see. I'm excited to dig into how do we create that visitor experience that really highlights sustainable tourism in a responsible community with strong community engagement. So I think we can build on that as the months and years go on. I know we don't always see eye to eye on where we should go with direction, but I appreciate having an open line of dialogue where we can share our vision for what does the good life mean for various different sectors of our economy and our community, and also identify concerns with current practices so that we can identify what can we change and how can we support our local business community, and how do we maybe advocate to senior levels of government. We've seen some really interesting things coming from both the provincial and federal government. I was watching today as they announced the paid sick leave project for starting in the new year. But I think that if we have a strong relationship with our business community, we can also help frame that conversation and hopefully build back better. So thank you very much for presenting. I look forward to going forward. And if there's any questions or concerns, I typically always attend the Chamber Council or Chamber of Commerce meetings and try to do a good job bringing that voice back to the council table.
Your Worship, you're muted.
How's that? Can you hear me now? Are there any other councillors have questions for our guests? Councillor Elliott?
One more for Stacey there. The support that we're getting from the provincial government and federal government regarding income support like CERB or various programs, what do you think how's been, like, basically there's an indication that there may be some less willingness for employees to go back to work with the CERB. Is that a real problem that you're hearing, or from the business world, from the restaurant and the service industry?
Yeah, thanks for your question. It's definitely been a concern as everything has unfolded. And so we are working closely with the BC Chamber of Commerce to make sure that our concerns are being heard at the provincial level and then up to the federal level as well. You know, I think that everything was rolled out very quickly as it needed to be. And there has been a willingness to kind of adjust and tweak these support measures as we've moved forward. So we did see movement on everything from the wage subsidy was restructured, CERB was opened up, the criteria to qualify for that, even the commercial rent pieces. So provincial and federal government has been quite responsive to hearing the feedback as it unfolds. And our chamber is a paid member of the BC Chamber of Commerce as well. So I think it's important to note that our chamber had one of 9 seats at the provincial level for their recovery task force. So, you know, it's great to underscore to mayor and council, to city staff, to all of our members in the community that we do have a voice at the table, and we are working with all levels of government to make sure that concerns are heard. So we've just heard that the wage subsidy, of course, is being extended. And as Councillor Sulz had mentioned, the sick pay piece is now being crafted and rolled out. So I think government's been quite responsive, which is very positive for all of us.
Yeah, I just wonder if we're going to get to a recovery stage and face a crisis of lack of workers. Or once we turn the corner on the COVID issue and things ramp up again, I think a few businesses I've talked to are worried that they're going to be run off their feet. The actual owners and the people who are in their day and night already, they're going to be more stressed.
Yeah, and we definitely saw that even when we opened up last year. We did hear of large hotels that had to close entire floors. So not only did they struggle with a lack of customers due to the restrictions, but when those were lifted, they just didn't have the staff to be able to operate at full capacity. So it's definitely noted. It is something that has been flagged to elected officials, provincial MLA and MP, as well as BC Chamber. But of course, no crystal ball.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks again. Any other comments or questions, Council? I want to again say thanks, Stacey and Guylaine. Appreciate all that you've done and for your presentation. Councillor Elliott, do you have another question? No, you just shut that off. Okay. All right. Thank you again, ladies. Appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. All right, Council, we're going to move on to item 9A, bylaws, finance, 5-year financial plan bylaw. Can I get a councillor to put that motion on the table? And then we can have a brief discussion. Councillor Brooks Hill.
That the 2021 to 2025 5-year financial plan bylaw number 2292 be read a first, second, and third time.
Seconder for the motion, please. Councillor Charlotte. Any discussion on the motion? Any comments, Ms. McCabe?
Not at this time, Your Worship.
All right. Council, any comments or questions? Councillor Palmer, you have your hand up. And then Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Just a question regarding the readings. The motion on the table is for the first, second, and third reading, but I note that it's also up for adoption. It seems to me that the normal practice that the adoption would be at a separate meeting. Is there any comment on that?
I believe we have to get this to the provincial government by the 15th of May. Is that correct, Ms. McCabe?
That is correct, Your Worship.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. I'm not 100% sure, but I believe that normally that the adoption is supposed to be done 24 hours after the third reading. Is there any comment on that, maybe from the corporate officer?
Ms. Lowe, Ms. McCabe, either one of you want to weigh in?
So, Your Worship, yes, normally that would be the case. There is a ministerial order in place that has been in place since the pandemic began last year that does allow us to do all 3 readings and adoption for financial based bylaws at this time. Expect it will revert back to the previous method next year.
So, Mayor Sulz, I'll just make a comment regarding that. The intention, I believe, behind the changes a year ago for COVID was to allow for emergency changes to legislation to allow these electronic meetings like we're doing right now, so that there wouldn't be delay when we were in the full lockdown over a year ago. And so I think this is an unnecessary pushing through process that's in breach of the legislation. And so the COVID excuse for not following a proper process, I think, is unfortunate. So maybe I'll save those comments for the next motion if people. But I'm really suggesting that we should follow the guidelines, and we can have a meeting. It's the legislation. If we were to follow that, it's 24 hours after third reading. And I just don't. It's a degradation of democracy when we start breaking the rules. But So if I may, I'll just make comment on the bylaw. I'll be voting against the bylaw as noted. I think we could have worked a lot harder to get down to a 0% tax increase. But I think I've expounded quite a bit on that in the past. So those are my comments. Thank you, Your Worship.
Great. Thank you for your comment. Councillor Elliott, did you have a comment or a question? I thought I saw your hand up.
Yes, just we're voting on, just for public awareness, we're just moving toward a 1% increase for the year. And that 1% is dedicated to reserve for roads.
Correct.
Yes, yes, okay.
Great. Councillor Brooks Hill, did you have a question?
Nope.
Okay, sorry. Any further questions or comments? I believe we're doing the right thing in moving this forward, and I'm supportive of this. So I'm going to ask the question, all in favor? Opposed? Note that Councillor Palmer is opposed. The rest of council, including the mayor, are in favor. Motion is carried. Moving on to item 9A2. Does someone want to put that motion on the table? Councillor Brooks Hill.
That the 2021 to 2025 5-year financial plan bylaw number 2292 be adopted.
Seconder for the motion, please. Councillor Chalette, discussion on this motion. Councillor Chalette, Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'd just like to make a comment that I appreciate the challenges we've been going through in this past year, not just with the COVID pandemic, which in itself is enough, but also in the staffing changes and disruption of various issues, including a by-election that brought on a new councillor halfway through this budgeting process. I think that there are a variety of reasons why we are pushed up to the wall on the May 15th deadline. I have no problem with approving this in this meeting, but I do also look forward to getting back to a more normal way of doing business, even through the pandemic challenges. I think it is important to allow for some separation between third reading and adoption. I just don't think that now is the appropriate time for this particular bylaw. But I do look forward to that process as we go forward with some of the other big ones we have on the docket this year.
Great. Thank you for your comment. Councillor Elliott, you have a comment, and then Councillor Palmer.
I guess my question is, what was the original intent to separate the two? Why was that legislation established? What's the normal process? Why is it established that way?
Ms. McCabe, do you want to weigh in?
Through your worship, unfortunately, that's a provincial legislation. It's been around as long as I've been here, so I'm assuming it's so that there can be some second thought. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if Ms. Lowe has anything else to add to that.
Ms. Lowe, any comment before I move on?
No, Your Worship, that was the original intent. However, there is nothing wrong with reading all this bylaw in one reading, as we do have a ministerial order from the province that is allowing us to do that.
Good, thank you. Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. So just for clarification, for my understanding, the ministerial order, I haven't read that. And so does that apply to everything, so that for any bylaws whatsoever? It does seem to defy what would be reasonable in the degradation of what I would call degradation of democracy. That, but I'm just does that allow us the power of adopting bylaws? Any bylaw, or is it specific to this or others? Maybe some just clarification on that.
Clarification, Ms. Lowe.
So, Your Worship, the bylaw is linked in the report or the ministerial order, and it does outline specific financial bylaws that are permitted to do this. So no, it's not for every bylaw. It's just for the financial aspect.
Right, thank you.
So my final comment is that, to me, this is not a difficult thing. It's just a special meeting after 24 hours. But I think I've commented enough on that. Thank you, Mayor Sulz.
Great, thank you, Councillor Palmer. Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Your Worship. I wonder, is this something we could defer to the committee of the whole meeting till 2 days from now?
No.
And the reason?
Well, Your Worship, committee of the whole isn't binding, so it would have to go to another council meeting after committee of the whole, because committee has to recommend to council. So it wouldn't be binding at committee of the whole. However, we could do a little council meeting prior to the committee of the whole meeting if council wishes.
I think for Councillor Elliott, do you have further comment before I make a statement?
I think as Ms. Lowe mentioned, I think it's an easy way to adhere to the intent of the bylaw and the provincial legislation if we deferred it to the next meeting or the next gathering that we have.
Okay, so we'd have to call a special meeting. We're here together today. I don't see anything changing between now and 2 or 3 days from now. I'm supportive of us moving that on.
Yeah, Your Worship, and you do have a resolution on the table.
Okay, I have a resolution on the table, so we would have to defer or vote it down. Okay, any further comments on this?
Don't vote it down.
Okay. Okay, saying no other comments? All those in favor of adopting the 5-year financial plan bylaw? Yeah. I'm in favor as well. So that's Ryan, Charlotte, Brooks Hill, Sulz in favor. Opposed? Elliott and Palmer opposed. So the motion's carried. Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to item 9B, tax rate bylaws. Someone want to put that motion on the table, please? Councillor Brooks Hill.
That the 2021 tax rates bylaw number 2293 be read a first, second, and third time.
Seconder for that motion, please. Councillor Charlotte, discussion on this motion. No questions, no comments. All right, I will ask the question. All those in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Moving on to item B2. Someone want to put that motion on the table, please? Councillor Brooks Hill.
That the 2021 tax rates bylaw number 2293 be adopted.
Seconder for the motion, please. Councillor Charlotte, any discussion on this motion? Seeing none, all in favor?
Oh.
Opposed?
Sorry, Worship, Councillor Palmer had his hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Okay, Councillor Palmer, you have a comment or a question?
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. For the same reason, I'll be voting against the adoption because I don't think it is necessary and it is a break from normal processes.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Any further comments or questions? Okay, I will now ask the question. All those in favor of this motion? Note, Ryan, Charlotte, Brooks Hill, and Sulz in favor. Opposed? Palmer and Elliott. Thank you. Motion's carried. Thank you, councillors. Moving on to unfinished business finance, proposed addition of donation box to property tax notices. Ms. McCabe, do you have a comment or presentation that you'd like to make regarding this?
No, Your Worship, nothing beyond what's in the report, but if there's any questions, I will do my best to answer them.
Okay. Any comments from councillors regarding what's in your package? Councillor Rond.
Thanks, Your Worship. I was just thinking, since the report recommends choosing a project, if council is in agreement that the food bank would be a good option for this year, since it has seen such an increase to demand as a result of COVID.
Okay. So any comments from other councillors? Are you okay with the donation box being put on this tax notice? Councillor Schlett, you have your hand up, so I'll go to you first.
Yeah, and my apologies, it may have been in the report. I was trying to read it thoroughly. It mentioned that the staff had consulted with other municipalities that have attempted this in the past or tried with this in the past. And I'm just curious as to the uptake success on that. It sounds like it would be some administrative work on our part. And I'm wondering if there's a cost benefit for that. There's a lot of promotions right now for donations to the food bank and other great charities in our community. I'm just wondering how much of an impact we can expect this to have.
So Ms. McCabe, I'll get you to weigh in before I comment.
Yeah, through Your Worship, The ones that the communities I did touch base with have only done this for their own purposes. I couldn't find any examples of municipalities that had actually collected donations, first of all, for other outside external organizations. And then secondly, I couldn't find anyone that actually had put it on their tax notice. So this would be a first in more than one way. And so, yes, administratively, it will definitely create extra effort at the front counter for sure, as I've outlined in the report. We've done it in the past for city properties or city projects such as the skateboard park and the splash park, and it does create work. So it's a matter of what council would like the finance staff to be, spending their time on, right? So there's benefits to it, but there's definitely going to be some administrative costs as well.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and bearing that in mind, there are definitely going to be administrative costs in consulting some of the community members and some of the staff. Quite concerned over the fact that they're concerned about their tax rates anyway as we go forward. And so a couple of people that I spoke to said, so you're going to put a donation box. From me, that's a personal insult. We're already asking to pay the city funds. So just making that statement. Councillor Palmer, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. I would concur with you on your comments and what you were hearing. I think there's a good idea and good intention. We have a report here. There's not a clear recommendation of a direction to go. So I think this is something that we should just table for future finance discussions at this time, because I think there's just too many matters on the table right now. And even though it's a great idea, I think it would be best if we just table this for the time being. I'll make a note. I believe to the Director of Finance. I think people can donate to the city if they wish at any time, and that the Director of Finance will issue essentially something that could be used as a tax receipt, I believe.
Comment, Ms. McCabe, and then I'll go on.
Through your worship, that is correct. The nature of what the donations are for is, I've learned, is actually is important. So, for instance, as I mentioned in the report, we can't actually give out donation receipts if somebody comes in and wants to give the city extra money to fix the potholes in the roads. However, when they want to come in and give us money to build a skate park or a splash park like we've done in the past, then that's an allowable contribution that gets a donation receipt.
Great, thank you. Councillor Rind.
Yeah, I think the concept of giving it to the food bank is not one that anybody will push back against. I mean, I can't imagine somebody saying, how dare you raise my taxes 1%, but also ask for money for the food bank. So I respectfully disagree that it's offensive. I also think that if we push this off, it's fine. It's not necessarily going to, raise a ton of money, but it is a step in the right direction. And if we start with something simple like the food bank, then it gives us something to iterate on versus having these conversations where we're trying to get it perfect. I just think we will learn a lot from starting small. And then when we have a project that is, like the skate park, we will have learned all these little routines and administrative tasks that have to get done. So I feel like the sooner we get started, the better. But that's just my opinion.
Great, thank you. Councillor Palmer, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. To Councillor Rind, so good comments, Councillor Rind. I guess one of some of the stuff that's going through my mind is one that's very easy to make a contribution to the food bank right now. So might we be creating confusion as to where donations should be going through? I understand and super appreciate your thought process on that. I just wonder if there might be more create some other problems and confusion on that. So, I could go either way on this, but I think probably it's better just in this time, we can even make a statement of encouraging people to make a donation to the food bank or charities of their choice, because they can do that directly. Those are just some comments, but I thank you very much for your comments.
Any further comments, councillors? Councillor Brooks-Hill.
Yeah, I really think that this is a good idea. I'm not sure that we should just rush into implementing it. My general feeling, as Councillor Palmer pointed out, there's already a lot of ways to donate to the food bank. If the city is going to be asking for donations on tax forms, I kind of feel like that is the place for a specific project for the city, or a general donate to the city and help lower other people's taxes. But I feel like the best idea would be, if we were going to be rebuilding the arena, as an example, that would be, in my mind, a perfect project where people can say, hey, this is a way that I can donate towards the arena. For this year, I don't think we should go ahead with it, but I think we should definitely be tabling this to next year's finance discussions, because I think it is a good idea.
All right, thank you for your comment. Councillor Palmer, you have your hand up.
If that was a motion by Councillor Brooks-Hill, it sounded like a motion. I would second that motion.
So, Councillor Brooks-Hill, do you want to make that a motion to put this into next year, table this to next year?
Yeah, I can make that a motion. Or I guess this year's finance discussions for next year.
For 2022.
Yeah.
Okay. And Councillor Palmer, you want to second that? Is that what you're saying? Okay. Any discussion on that motion for tabling to the next tax year? Seeing none, I'll ask the question. All those in favor of putting that into the next tax year discussions? Motion's carried. Thank you. All right. Thank you for that. We're going to move on to staff reports. 11A. We have a presentation on the consolidated financial statements.
Sorry, Your Worship, I had to unmute myself. I'm going to just share my screen. Is that okay, Guylaine? Request control. Sorry, just one moment. I'm just going to do something a little bit differently at the beginning of this. Angie's going to speak to the consolidated PSAB statements, but I wanted to have a little bit of a run through of the management statements for you. And so I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, if Guylaine will let me. So just one moment, please.
You shouldn't need to request control, Tanya.
Oh, interesting. It wouldn't let me share.
You have to hit the little arrow.
Do you see the up arrow beside the leave button on the top right?
Yeah, I did that. Yeah.
Not the request.
There you go.
Yeah.
No, I've got it now. Yep, I have it. Technical difficulties. Okay, can you see? So City of Revelstoke Schedule 4 General Fund Statements?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I succeeded. And then I lose the sight of all you guys, which is, okay. So I just wanted to run through these because these are the statements that actually are a little bit more closely aligned with the budget process. And so I know in the past there's been some questions that have been asked about the consolidated statements. And so I thought I would just do a bit of a quick run through. This is a Coles Notes versions of fund statements, so to speak. So we start out with the, there's first of all, there's a separate set of balance sheet, statement of equity, and what we call statement of revenues and expenditures for each of the funds. And so we'll have the general fund, we'll have the water fund, the sewer fund, Big Eddie. We also have a couple of other smaller ones that we do as well. And so you'll notice that for each of these balance sheets, there is a split within the funds between the operating and the capital. And so the top part is the operating assets and liabilities, and then the bottom half of each section is the obviously the capital. And so another note that the cash and investments, that would be the money that's being held for all of the reserves, the operating reserves, the surpluses, and also for day-to-day cash flow purposes. And receivables would include things like property taxes. In fact, it's predominantly property taxes. I also want to make a comment about the capital assets under the capital fund for the balance sheet. That represents the book value, so the historical cost of the assets, less the amortization that we've booked to date, also less any debt. So as we pay down the debt, the value of the capital assets, the capital assets is the, I'm talking about the equity and capital assets, my apologies. So the capital assets is the historical cost less the amortization over time. And then the other one I wanted to point out is that in the under liabilities capital fund, you'll see that the long-term debt is going down. And so that is decreasing. There's no new debt that's been taken on under any of the funds for 2020 at this time. And so as you can see, there's a reserve for future capital expenditures. That's some of the reserve funds they're showing across all the different statements. And so then the equity and capital assets, what I'm talking about here, this number ties into this number down here, which obviously you can see there's the additions. We've bought some from our reserve funds. We had some cost sharing grants that paid for some of them. And then there's the retirement of debt. And then there's the amortization. So is that any questions on any of that? Sorry if I'm going too fast.
Any questions, councillors? Saying none, carry on.
Okay. This is the operating fund's general, the revenues and expenditures for the general fund. So this obviously has all the property taxations, and a couple of things I wanted to point out is you'll see that the revenues from budget for recreational services are obviously under budget because the facilities were closed down for quite a bit of the year. I'll also point out that under unconditional grants, we've got 2.6 million there on a budget of 556. That is where the restart grant that we received, that the city received from the province, that's where that revenue shows up, is in there. Everything else is fairly consistent. Some of the expenses are under and over. In the operating statement, we do flow through what we call non-tangible capital asset expenditures. So in the capital budget, there'll be some things that are not actually an asset for accounting purposes. So when we do those, so a lot of the project plans and bylaw updates and things that are being done by development services are a great example of this. The actual expenditures show up as an expense on this statement. Yeah, and so there's the details of all the different departments in there for you, and you'll see that the expenditures for the civic properties for recreational purposes are under budget because, of course, they were closed down, and so that's predominantly staffing costs that are lower. And then under fiscal services, you'll see that this is the transfers. This is what was budgeted to be used for capital expenditures in here, and then this is all the transfers to reserves, all of these amounts down here. And you'll see that this one in particular is quite a bit over budget. That was the additional transfer that you approved to go in at the last meeting. That again is the 2.1 million in the restart funds that we got. And so that's why that transfers over budget. And then the other ones flow through very similarly. So if there's any questions, Your Worship, then I'd be happy to try to answer some.
Okay, any questions, councillors? You could raise your hands electronically if you have questions. Saying none, carry on, Ms. McHale. Just a minute, Councillor Ryan, do you have a question?
Yeah, on the notes to consolidated financial statements, note number 3 talks about the market value of the city's portfolio investments going down significantly. Was there a big withdrawal?
There was, yeah, so we'll get to the consolidated statements, but yes, there was in 2020, we had a number of investments that matured out of their actual investment accounts and were held in as a cash account. And so that's why the market value, they would just sit at their values. So that's why that market value in investments dropped, because the actual amount invested also decreased. So, but if you've got
little loss, so the money got withdrawn or not?
No, it's just sitting in a cash account, I guess is the best way to describe it. And then it was reinvested this year.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, I'm going to stop presenting. Angie, are you there?
Yes, I am.
So I'm going to introduce Angie. She is the auditor who did the audit for the consolidated financial statements for the city. And so she will walk you through some of those.
All right. Carry on. Thanks, Angie.
Did you want me to display the audited statements, Angie?
You know what? I can share my screen if that's easiest and just go through it that way. So thanks very much, Your Worship and councillors, and for Tanya for having me here today. As Tanya mentioned, my name is Angie Spencer. I'm a partner with BDO, so we conduct the annual audited financial statements. So I will just walk you through. Tanya's already provided more granular detail on the kind of by fund changes for the year. So I'll just give you the highlights of the audit. So from a consolidated perspective, all this means is that, you know, rather than breaking down by kind of water or sewer function, it's all just consolidated in terms of the assets, liabilities, and also it's a requirement that it's reported under public sector accounting standards, which does have some nuances that are different than your budgeted kind of categories, which is why you'll see some discrepancies between, you know, where you're determining to have a zero budget. The financial statements kind of look different to that. So on page 2 and 3 is the independent audit report. Effectively, we have the most important paragraph up top here is that we've issued a clean or unqualified audit opinion on the financial statements. That means that they are, as a result of our audit testing, we've deemed them to be free of any material misstatement, and also highlights in here just our auditor's responsibilities around the consolidated statements, and they will be dated today's date, subject to your approval today. So page 4 is a summary of the assets, liabilities, and non-financial assets, which is largely your capital assets, as at December 31st, 2020. So there was a significant increase in cash. I think Councillor Ryan, you had brought up the change in your portfolio investments that went down from 21.6 million to 11.4 million. A lot of that had been just GICs that came due and were redistributed into cash, so sitting there on your cash balance, which is a lot of that allocated in reserves to be spent for future spending. Some other notable changes on the balance sheet. There was a significant increase in accounts receivable. This is grants receivable with the ongoing projects. One of the most significant projects was the roundabout. So there was some outstanding claims that are going to be received to reimburse for the costs as they're incurred related to that project. So we also have the investment in RCFC and RCEC. So those entities are wholly owned by the City of Revelstoke. They're accounted for using the equity method, which means that the initial investment plus or minus any profits that are earned from those companies. So RCFC had a profitable year. That investment continues to increase, and RCEC had a deficit during the fiscal year, so that balance of the investment is sitting at just over 63,000. So total assets came in at 41.7 million. Liabilities grew from 26.3 to 28 million. One of the largest reasons for that increase is the timing of payables. So there was some relief with the school tax was able to be deferred until January, which is not consistent with historical payments. So that was quite a large payable that was included in this year's balance.
Tangible capital assets grew from 76.2 million up to 85.7 million. These are recorded at cost less the amortization. So amortization is the annual expense over the useful life of those assets. So there was about $12 million worth of capital asset additions during the year. Some significant components was land purchase and development of roads, etc., related to the roundabout, and also water development during the year as well. So moving on to the statement of operations, this is a summary of revenue and expenditures for the year. So total revenues came in at 36.1 million versus 29.5 million. Probably the largest increase related to that is around government grants. So a lot of the grant funding corresponds with the timing of the capital projects that grants was received related to, so the roundabout in this case. And in addition, as Tanya had mentioned, the COVID Restart Grant, which is recognized in these statements this year of just over $2 million. Expenditures was fairly flat, increased slightly over last year, so came in at 24.4 million. Some notable changes in there was, some increase in costs of maintenance, etc., around roads for transportation services, and also a decline that was offset by a decline around recreation and cultural services with some of the programs and the pool being closed down, etc. There were some savings there for 2020. So overall, the annual surplus came in at 11.6 million. As Tanya mentioned, when we convert to public sector accounting standards, the capitalized items or long-term significant assets are capitalized to the balance sheet, so they're not reflected in these expenditures, only the amortization charge. So I'm not proposing to go through all the notes to the financial statements. I did want to highlight one point. So the notes just provide more detail to the balance sheet and the income statement and their requirement to provide specific disclosures related to public sector accounting standards. There weren't any significant changes to public sector accounting standards. There was, however, with the COVID relief grant funding, a requirement to kind of disclose a continuity on an annual basis of how those funds have been spent during the year. So this just provides some detail that the ministry will require year over year until this full amount of the funding has been expensed. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have on the financial statements or on the audit in general.
Councillors, any questions? Thanks, Angie, again for your presentation and for auditing our books. We know they're in good hands when you're looking at them, so we appreciate that. Any comments or questions, councillors? Councillor Elliott, you have a question.
Thank you, Your Worship. Actually, I have a couple of the RCEC, the contribution, the asset that we purchased or the money that went into it. It's significantly more than what we're carrying on our balance sheet. Has that been written off over the last number of years? Is that how it's?
That's correct. So using that modified equity method, you originally capitalize it on the balance sheet at the amount that was paid or invested, and then that amount is adjusted either up for any profits that are allocated back, less any dividends received. And unfortunately, in our CEC's case, there has been multiple years of deficits with closures and inability to run at capacity, etc. So that's been really written down over time, as you've mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's an issue we have yet to address, and I think Gary, the mayor, is trying to address that, get a handle on it. The annual surplus, that doesn't include the reserve taxation that we incur, does it?
It does not, no. And there is a note to the financial statements that kind of tries to go backwards. It's on page 21 or note 15 that illustrates what you budgeted, which is a nil surplus, and works its way back to reconcile back to what the surplus, budgeted surplus is per the financial statements. So there's some items, like I mentioned, capital is one of them that doesn't reflect in that surplus amount.
So we've had a series of years here. I'm not sure how far back, but each year we tend to have a surplus. I think last year was 3 million, 2 million my first year at it. This on top of the reserve is improved. Basically, we're adding more. So I'm wondering whether overachieving on our revenue. And if our revenue is taxation, that's a tricky one we're in right now.
Yes, I
Ms.
think Tony
McCabe?
wants to. Yeah.
Ms. McCabe, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Your Worship. You should always see a surplus at the bottom of any consolidated PSAB statements for any municipality, and that's because they hopefully are putting money into reserves and also spending money on capital assets and paying down their debt. If you don't see a surplus, then you've actually, the municipalities can be in some serious trouble because they're not collecting enough to make those payments. So it's like a business. If a business isn't creating enough net income to then replace its assets and pay down its debt, then the business is going to have cash flow issues and eventually will go under. And so municipalities are very similar that way. Our surplus is being used to put into reserves, which are then using to fund capital asset additions, and it's also being used to fund debt repayments. So that's where the surplus is going.
Yeah, I get that. It's just a matter when we determine a tax rate, we don't anticipate budgeting for surplus. You know, if we get it, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say to you, Bishop, we don't budget for a surplus. So on the fund statements and the budget side of things, we don't budget for a surplus. When you convert what we do on the budget side, which is required under provincial legislation, to what the public sector accounting board requires us to do, when you convert those budget numbers over to what PSAB requires, you end up with a budgeted surplus. And that's where that budgeted surplus is in the budget column on the statements.
And sorry, one more, Tanya. So this year it's $11 million surplus. That now, if the grants part was taken out for COVID, what would the surplus be? It
would have been $2 million less than that. $2
million. That's it.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So our surplus this year is $9 million.
That's correct, because we built a roundabout, and so we have $5-6 million of the grant revenue that's in there as well.
Oh, I'm sorry. So
the okay. Grant revenue, we have to report all of the grant revenue when we receive it for the roundabout, but we don't get to record the expenditures when we spend it all, which was in 2020. That expenditure gets recorded as a tangible capital asset and amortized over time. So you basically have a mismatch between when the revenue is recorded and when the expenditure is recorded.
So the grant that we received, though, the $5 million, that covers the expense of the roundabout.
It does, yes. But we had to recognize the full grant in revenue in 2020, but we didn't get to recognize the expense because it's an asset and it gets capitalized and then amortized over time.
So we've got $2 million for COVID, $5 million for the roundabout.
That's correct.
So on 11, so that leaves $4 million as our operating.
Yes.
Am I got that right? So yes, that's more than last year's, which was $3 million surplus.
It is. So the budget for last year was the budgeted surplus for PSAB purposes for 2020 was just over $3 million. And so now we have the roundabout grant in there as well as the restart grant. And then also the recreation services as a whole were under budget. And so that increased the accumulated the surplus as well. Even though the snow removal was over budget, the recreational facilities offset that to some degree. So, yeah.
I'm just seeing a trend. Like basically, in the time we've been in council, it's gone from 2 to 3 to 4 and now 5. So I just wonder. It's a touch point for me that I'd be watching.
Through your worship, that means that you're building assets. It means you're putting money into reserves and you're building assets with those reserves. And it also means that we're getting grant money to help pay for a lot of these capital projects as well. And so when you're doing those three things, which are all positive, you're definitely going to be seeing an accumulated surplus at the bottom. Yes.
So that doesn't necessarily mean we have $4 million extra dollars in our jeans. That means that we have more money invested in assets as well. So if you want to put a roundabout in your back pocket, that's basically what we've got as far as extra money, or that's how it's showing. Am I correct on that, or am I off base?
You're correct, Your Worship.
Well, actually, I'm not sure. I mean, basically, we've accounted for the roundabout, the $5 million. We've accounted for the COVID, but the $4 million extra, that's $1 million higher than last year's surplus, is not what we're talking about, Gary. It's not about assets. I'm it's just expenditures are less than our revenues, and we've got $4 million extra this year, and I'm just trying to find out how to make sense of it.
Ms. McCabe.
It would have gone into debt repayments. That would have been part of it, and so that you can't record as an expense, and it was transferred into reserves.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right.
You're welcome.
Any further comments or questions for Ms. Spencer? Okay, thanks, Angie. Appreciate your time. Oh, Councillor Ryan, do you have a question?
Yeah, what is the usual, like, do councils ever not approve statements? And if so, what are the reasons for that usually?
In my experience, I've not had a council not approve them. There's been times where they have challenged or asked, significant number of questions, but I've not experienced someone not approving financial statements.
Okay, thanks.
Any further comments, councillors? Okay,
Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Thank you, Angie, for your report. I think it would be valuable for us if you could just, at a very, very high level, in lay terms, explain what this means, because there's the stuff that Councillor Elliott's talking about, so there's sort of understanding, and then there's also the other one that I note is what potential liability that RCEC, this arm's length corporation there, what comes back. But basically, I'm just coming back to that big question at the high level. Yeah. We approve this, and then what's the limitations as to, in one example would be whether the corporation is being run well or not. I don't think you're necessarily reporting on that specifically, whether it's good operations or whether we're doing wise surplus things. So could you just talk at that very high level?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, I think what you're asking is, from your role as council in adopting and approving these financial statements today, what kind of implication is that? Really, this is the accounting of historical data, and it's your job to be reviewing this and be comfortable with the numbers as presented. Of course, there is some reliance on your finance team to be providing that detail as you go, but it's just really an oversight of ensuring that you are comfortable and able to approve the financial statements. And I think if I could just go back to Councillor Elliott's question, I know it looks kind of probably overwhelming when you see these, large significant surplus, but just to reiterate what Tanya was saying, from an accounting perspective, there is a requirement to capitalize any capital items. So they are not expensed and included in your net surplus every year. So for instance, last year, you may have had $11 million surplus, but you spent $12.3 million in infrastructure, which shows up on the balance sheet as capitalized, and only a portion of that is expensed year over year to abide by those standards. The other piece, of course, is debt, which is a huge component as well. And as Tanya had mentioned, only the interest is expensed for the surplus piece. So it is really important to go back to the budgeted statements and, look at those budget to actuals. And really, this is the piece of making sure that they're compliant with the public sector accounting standards, which is a requirement of the province. Did I answer the question okay there, Councillor Palmer? Yeah.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Angie.
Any further questions for Ms. Spencer? Okay, we have a motion here. I'm going to ask if someone would put this motion on the table, please. Councillor Burks-Hill.
That the City of Revelstoke consolidated financial statements for the year ended December 31st, 2020 be approved.
Okay, is there a seconder for the motion, please? Councillor Charlotte. Any further discussion on the motion? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Spencer. Thank you, Ms. McCabe.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Again, appreciate your time on this. All right, I want to carry on to 11B, Development Services. We have a presentation. Do we have Development Services staff here to make this presentation? Ms. Hartling, you're here.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I'll just share my screen here. I just want to make sure you can hear my mic.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Through Your Worship, just before I begin, can you see the first slide there for the development permit?
Yes,
Thank you.
we can. Thank you.
So the subject property owner's agent has applied for a commercial industrial development permit. It's for the form and character of a proposed workshop. And the agent is also concurrently working on a building permit. It's BP 2021-009 for the proposed workshop. The staff recommendation is that the development permit application be approved for the form and character of the proposed workshop with a precondition to issuance. The city and agent have followed the provincial site identification requirements for development permits and building permits. It's a requirement as February 1st of this year, and have submitted the subject property's site disclosure statement to the province for review. The province has notified the city that the development permit and building permit, in order to be issued, the agent must first receive a release from the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. And this is with respect to any requirements pertaining to site contamination under the Environmental Management Act, EMA, and then the Contaminated Sites Regulation, the CSR. So staff have added this requirement as a precondition to the issuance of the development permit, which is with a staff recommendation on the screen there. So just a bit of the presentation overview that I'll go through with council is the background property details, the proposal details, the staff evaluation of the proposed workshop, and then concluding with a staff recommendation. So the subject property is located at 951 Sandstone Road. This is within the Big Eddy neighborhood. The current uses of the property are a gravel stockpile yard for ready mix operation and gravel sales. The property is zoned heavy industrial district in the zoning bylaw. This is M3 zoning. It's also within the commercial industrial development permit area, which is what council is considering today. And the property is surrounded by industrial development that's adjacent to the property, with residential development located across Sandstone Road to the east. And this is over about 200 meters away from the proposed workshop, which is just to the rear of the property in the southwest corner. The development permit application is a request for approval for the form and character of a new workshop. And as noted in the applicant's proposal summary that is also attached to the council report, the new workshop is being built to accommodate the requirement for repairs to their asphalt and ready mix trucks and equipment. And the workshop would include a shop, wash bay, storage, office, washrooms, and a lunchroom. And the proposed exterior materials are steel cladding with a metal roof. And the exterior colors are charcoal roof, Aztec blue siding, burnished slate trim, and a fox gray base, which you can see in the rendering just in front of you here of the proposed workshop. So the existing office for the site is located at 1031 Sandstone Road, which is adjacent to the gravel yard. And this has existing landscaping with grass, trees, and a picnic table, which you can see in the Google Street View here of 1031 Sandstone Road with 951 Sandstone Road, the subject property site adjacent to it. So as the new workshop proposal is in the gravel storage yard, the property owner has no plans to submit or propose new landscaping for the subject area due to the equipment and truck traffic on the site next to the proposed workshop. So the subject property contains trees and retaining blocks you can see with 951 Sandstone Road next to the roadway, providing screening and noise buffering. So due to the proposed location of the workshop being around 200 meters from the public roadway, no further landscaping has been required from staff for the proposal. So you can just see here the site plan, Sandstone Road access, next to 899 Sandstone Road. The access comes back to the shop here, and lining the road there is where the tree stand is located, which in the next slides, I'll just show you some more site photos. So you'll see here 1031 Sandstone Road with the, this is taken in April, so they are deciduous trees where the leaves aren't like the last photo, but you can see the trees here, the picnic tables, landscape grass. There's an entrance to the site, and then there's retaining blocks in front of 951 Sandstone Road. And the second image here is the other access to the site as well, with the tree stand next to it. So as the application does not seek to vary the requirements set forth in the zoning bylaw, no public consultation under the Local Government Act is required. And staff have sent out referrals for the development permit application and have received no concerns from internal or external departments. Staff are supportive of the development permit application as the proposed workshop and current development of the property responds to applicable guidelines. I'll just go through some of the guidelines here with you. From the commercial industrial development permit area. So the form and character of the proposed workshop does build upon the existing neighborhood character. The scale, mass, material, and colors of the proposed workshop, they project a high quality image in what is a predominantly industrial landscape around it. The surrounding uses, the immediate adjacent surrounding uses are all industrial, and the proposed workshop is located at the rear of the property and screened from the existing residential properties that are located across from Sandstone Road, which is to the east. The location of the workshop at the rear of the property minimizes any adverse impacts to the residential properties located across the road. There is some existing soft landscaping, which is at the neighboring adjacent property where the office site is and the entrance to the property. And then there's also the existing tree stand, which I just discussed with the retaining blocks that you saw in the site photos. For parking, this is proposed to be near the workshop, which is screened and not located in the front of the property, which the policies require it not to be in the front of the property. And access roads and parking are designed for large vehicles, machinery, and equipment. Garbage and recycling are screened from the road. And any signage, there's no proposed signage with this application, but any future signage would be evaluated in accordance with the sign bylaw. The staff recommend that the application be approved. If council is supportive of the staff recommendation, then the resolution on the screen in front of you can be considered. If a council does approve the application, the agent would first have to fulfill the development permit condition on the screen as a requirement before issuance of the development permit. Thank you, Your Worship. That concludes my presentation.
Certainly. Okay, Council, they have a resolution on the screen and in your package. Does someone want to put that resolution on the table? And then we can have a brief discussion. Councillor Charlotte.
The development permit DP 2021-002 be approved at 951 Sandstone Road as is on the screen.
Great, thank you. Seconder for that motion, please. Councillor Palmer. Any further discussion on the motion? Is very explicit in what Ms. Hartling has stated. Councillor Elliott.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just my curiosity here. The gravel plant that's in place, it already has, I'm sure, the environmental and the climate change issues addressed, or whatever they do. It's been operating there for quite some time. Is this overkill? I mean, it's basically a new building on the site. Is this standard process, or what are we doing?
Ms. Hartling.
Yeah, through Your Worship. So as of February 1st, 2021, their requirement for building permits, development permits, and subdivisions is that a site disclosure statement be submitted to the city for review to see if there's any activities on Schedule 2. If the applicant does check off that activities on Schedule 2, it's outlined through the regulations that we do send it to the province for an additional review, and they would they respond back if the applicant does need to get a release. There's a few different measures that they would respond with. So we are working with the province right now, and if the application does trigger a schedule, or if the proposal is a Schedule 2 listed in that, it's the Contaminated Sites Regulation, and the Environmental Management Act is where it's listed. So it's not up to city staff. It is something that we have to do with every single building permit, development permit, and subdivision application as of February. Most are residential properties, but it's just if there's ever been any existing potential contaminated site use, that there's this extra basically screening tool that they would have to get released in order for us to issue the permit. So it is a newer requirement.
Great, thank you.
Is it a pretty onerous endeavor to go through? Do you know?
Through your worship. So we do have the forms on our website, and they're a fillable form. It's the owner filling out all the legal information of the property, coordinates, submitting a site plan. Most of the information you would have already for any development permit, building permit, subdivision application. So it's another administrative form to fill out for sure. But it is information you'd be filling out on other forms already. There's just a few check boxes that you'd have to fill out when you do read the Schedule 2, if you do fall under that one of those uses that are listed. So then staff would review that, and if we're not sure, we would contact the province if we can continue on with issuing the development permit or not. And that's what staff have done. We've submitted it just to make sure that it doesn't trigger a site investigation. And if it doesn't, then the application continue and be issued. So this one is an industrial site, so we have forwarded it off to the province just to make sure that they have their release from the province.
Great, thank you. Any further comment, Councillor Elliott? Okay, Councillor Palmer, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. And thank you, Ms. Hartley. Again, a good report. It's clear, it's easy to follow the logic behind it. I think this one is a very straightforward application. It's heavy industrial, 3 zoning. So it's, if anything, they're doing just a spectacular job on a nice building. It's going to fit there. So thank you for the report. A question, and it's hypothetical. It doesn't necessarily relate to this, but it does relate to another development application that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. If there was substantial change in the use of that building, so say if there was, it was going to, instead we found out it was for residential use, or if there was it was going to be for a climbing, recreational or climbing change, would they be in breach of the development permit if there was that sort of substantial change in use?
Through your worship, so the development permit is specifically for the form and character of the proposed building. So it's for construction works of any buildings on a site that fall into a development permit area. So it's because they're proposing a new building is why this permit is required. We do know what the use is that they're proposing, but they could change the use inside the building. It's the exterior of the building that we're reviewing. So if they were to do a listed permitted use and change that use, they would not need to amend their development permit, because we're looking at the siting, the landscaping, the screening of what that building looks like on the site. I'm not sure if Ms. Wade has anything to add, but.
Ms. Wade.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just want to clarify for Councillor Palmer that development permits do not regulate land use.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. So specifically in the development permit, it's specifying that the conditions are there, the actual use is specified. And if there was a change, it could change aspects of that. So I think that certainly leads to confusion for me. But I think we'll talk more about that later on with the other one, because it doesn't apply this one here. I think it's going to be very, very straightforward, and that's a good report.
Good. So any other questions, Councillor Ryan, pertaining to this development?
Yeah, why then do we even list the use if it's irrelevant?
Ms. Hartling?
Through the worship, it's what the applicant is currently proposing for the site and is in line with their existing activities. It gives council an idea of what they're proposing. If council doesn't want to hear that as background information, we don't have to add it. It's just what's been added to the application and the proposal from the applicant and added to the review.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any further questions regarding the development presentation before you? Seeing none, I'm going to ask the question. Oh, Councillor Charlotte, you have a question statement?
Just a quick comment that I do appreciate getting that additional information, but I can appreciate the confusion when we get, it's a tough balance to find, right? Is having all the information to have a well-informed discussion, but then the information that is beyond the scope of the initial question does cause a bit of confusion. But I just wanted to state that I really appreciate the report, and I do appreciate getting that extra information. I'm not sure how we could maybe better clarify what is part of the instance at hand and versus how much is for our information. But thank you.
Ms. Wade, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through to Councillor Charlotte. Thank you for that observation, Councillor Charlotte. As part of our moving forward with the OCP, we're going to be clarifying the language around development permits. Development permits, as per the legislation, are for the form and character of buildings and how buildings are put on land that are zoned. So I just wanted to clarify you, and I do concur that our language will be improved with our OCP updates.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Palmer, you still have your hand up, or you've raised it again?
I've raised it again. Thank you, Mayor Sulz. So just for clarity, the draft development permit specifically says that the land described herein shall be developed strictly in accordance with the plans and specifications contained in Schedule A. So that's the whole layout there. So when it's So that is a condition of the development permit. Is that enforceable, or is that a non-enforceable aspect? And that might be a question more for the director.
And through your worship, I can also answer. If you're looking at the site plan, so the siting of the building, if that was to change the size of the building, any aspect of the siting, parking, like if any of that was to change, staff would review to see if the proposal is still in compliance with the development permit area that was issued. So anything that is to do with that building would have to meet the attachments with the development permit.
Okay. Thank you, Mayor Sulz.
Thank you. Any further questions, councillors? Okay, I will ask the question. All those in favor? Thank you. This is passed unanimously. Thank you, Ms. Hartling. Appreciate your input. We're going to go on to item 11C. We also have a presentation. This is a sand and gravel application and license of occupation. So Ms. Hartling, you have a presentation on that?
Yes, Your Worship. Let's bring it up here. Can you see that on your screen there?
I just have to click on it. Yes, councillors are saying yes. Go ahead.
Thank you. So the city has been referred on a Crown Land tenure application. It's for a license of occupation for sand and gravel purposes. It's been classified as, the applicant has called it the West Side Pit Expansion. So staff recommendation is that the city responds to the province recommending refusal of the application, as proposed use is not compatible with the city's Section 17 reserve, and the city has a feasibility study underway for the development of these lands, and this is for a technology park and associated uses. So you can see the staff recommendation. There's 2 recommendations on the screen. So before council votes on the recommendation, I just wanted to go through the background of the application and the review. So the proposed west side pit expansion area is approximately 8.68 hectares. It's located on Crown land and adjacent to the existing West Side Road pit tenure. This is 4403844 and is the tenure area in highlighted in red on the image there. And this is to expire July 24th, 2023. The subject application is highlighted in yellow on the image next to it. So this area is zoned Rural Residential 60 Hectare District, RR60. It's designated Urban Reserve, and within the Commercial and Industrial Development Permit area, Area C, and the corner of it is within the Very High Environmentally Sensitive Development Permit area, Area J of the OCP. And the green area highlighted there is the city's Section 17 Reserve. And the entire application is located within this reserve. This reserve was established for future development purposes, and it was originally created in 2009 through a Section 16 reserve. So the applicant had applied for a similar tenure application for sand and gravel purposes in 2019. You can see the location of the application in the image highlighted in red. The current application for 2021, next to it is in yellow. Both applications are in the Section 17 reserve for future development purposes. At the time in 2019, the city did not support the proposed use of the gravel pit in the Section 17 reserve and did send refusal comments to the province. And the province did then deny the 2019 license of occupation application for the pit there that you can see highlighted in red. So the current and new application is within, as noted, the Section 17 lands. City staff do understand that the province must accept all license of occupation applications that are within Section 17 lands. And this is to determine if the proposal is compatible or not compatible with the designated use area. So as a Section 17 is designated for future development purposes, at the initial review stage, when Front Counter BC does get the application, the province is not able to determine if the application is or is not compatible with the reserve area, as the designated use is quite general for future development purposes. The province has informed staff that since the subject lands are conditionally withdrawn through a Section 17, then the city does need to inform the province whether the proposal is compatible with the intent of these lands. So staff are currently undertaking feasibility studies for the lands, and this is for further the development and implementation of a technology park and associated uses. So as such, staff continue to provide the same comments as a proposed gravel extraction use would conflict with the proposed future technology park and the intent of the Section 17 withdrawal of lands. So to potentially stop applications that are not compatible with this Section 17 reserve, this is before going through the full provincial public review process that we're in right now. So this is the province it's being assigned to an authorization specialist and then sending out advertising, public engagement, referrals. The city may need to update the Section 17 reserve with the province to outline a more specific designated use area, as right now it is classified as future development purposes. So the province has requested that the city choose one of the following recommendations in response to the Crown Land application. So we have a list of 4 that they provide on an online form, which we submit through their e-referral system. So 1 is approval of application is supported. 2, no objection to approval of project. 3, no objection to approval of project subject to conditions. And number 4 is recommend refusal of project due to reasons outlined. So staff recommend number 4, refusal. And if the staff recommendation is supported by council, staff will complete the provincial online referral form. And the online referral form, we will attach the council report and an additional letter to the province recommending refusal of the application. Should council not wish to support staff recommendation on the screen before you, council can consider to amend the recommendation. Thank you, Your Worship.
All right, council, we have a motion before you for refusal. Does someone want to put that motion on the table, please? Councillor Brooks-Hill.
That the provincial referral for the proposed sand and gravel license of occupation application referral number 129712183-008 be completed, stating that the city recommends refusal of the application as the proposed use is not compliant with the city's Section 17 reserve, which was established for a technology park.
Seconded for the motion, please. Councillor Palmer. Any further discussion on the motion? Definitely, I'm in support of the staff on this. We have a Section 17. We do not want to have any more sand and gravel on our Section 17. And so, Ms. Hartling, one question as we move forward, just a little off target. You said the existing sand and gravel pit expires in 2023. They have to reapply for that existing proposal as that expires, or is it a renewal?
Through Your Worship, the site has been basically used up. So my understanding is that they'd be going through reclamation.
All right, thank you for that.
I understand that has been started.
Okay. Councillor Charlotte, Councillor Palmer.
Great, thank you, Your Worship. I'm also in support of this. I think this aligns with the expanded Section 17 we've been discussing around the Jordan River. One of the topics that's been brought up in the past was looking at, and this was ages ago, looking at a needs assessment for gravel. With all the construction and highway development going on around us, I know that it is a resource that is needed. I remember having discussion around both a needs assessment and looking for solutions to that challenge that do not involve our Jordan River. And I was just curious as to if that's still a thing, what progress and what we can expect, please.
Okay. Ms. Hartland, do you have any comment on that sort of idea?
Through Your Worship, I'm not aware of any needs assessment being completed. I do know it is something that the city and both the regional district have noted on many referral comments. I understand the province would not be the one doing the needs assessment. It would be the applicant doing that. So that could be maybe a condition on comments to the applicant. The province does receive applications as they come in of sites that the applicant chooses. I'm not sure what the process would be with the province, or if it is a process available, if they would be doing a needs assessment, just because it's such a large area. I think it would be applicant driven. But that is something that we have put on comments before, so I'm not sure if that's something that council wants to continue pushing for.
Okay. Ms. Wade, you have your hand up before I go to another councillor.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, just to expand on what Ms. Hartland has said, is that we have talked about this in regards to the OCP review. We don't, of course, the province, it's their lands, but in consultation with our OCP review, we have a very large area of DP areas for sand and gravel in our OCP. We need to clean up that policy and address those DP areas. And we have discussed this with the province in our conversations. And I do know that in the temporary permit that was issued, a needs assessment was one of those things that was to be looked at. And so to Ms. Hartling's point, in conditions of temporary permits, that is a condition the province can put on. And we have also been talking with the province about how we move forward with our OCP update in regards to this. We do, by the local government Act have to identify areas for sand and gravel in our OCP. That is a regulatory requirement, but we need to look at the scope that's in our old OCP and look at that in needs assessment, and as well as how our environmentally sensitive lands are. So that's all part of the OCP update.
Go ahead, Councillor Palmer.
Oh, thank you. So through the chair, yeah, a couple of questions. Mayor Sulz, are you there, or have you left?
Yep, just pulling down the blinds in my office because it's like a sauna, so I apologize.
Oh, okay, got you. Okay. So a couple questions. So the feasibility study, can somebody just comment as to this status? Because I don't have any knowledge on that feasibility study, what council's decided or where that's at.
Any comments, Ms. Lowe, regarding the feasibility study, or Ms. Wade, on this section 17?
Through your worship, I can speak a little bit. I've been working with Director Braun in regards to the section 17. It'll be led by Community Economic Development. They are doing a feasibility study looking at what the highest and best use for those lands would be. We're working with them to help them with the process. And I understand from Director Braun that this will be taking place over the next few months. And we meet every 2 weeks to discuss the matters. So maybe Director Braun wants to add.
Ms. Braun, would you like to weigh in? Sorry, I didn't see you there earlier.
That's okay, through your worship. Yes, I think a couple of points to clarify. There was a feasibility study carried out under my predecessor, Ellen Mason. I believe it was in 2016 or 2017 that did look at setting those lands aside for a tech park, and there was a study done at the time. It needs to be refreshed. Part of the funding that was obtained through the Rural Dividend Fund that my other predecessor, Nicole Furcott, obtained from the province was to look at the possibility of developing a tech park as one of the project deliverables. And we have actually since gone back to the Rural Dividend Fund to request that we have an extension to the project given the pandemic and the current building of our fabrication lab. And that, looking at this section 17 land and its future development is a long game, and certainly outside the deliverables of a 2-year funding project from Rural Dividends. So as part of the OCP review, we'll be working with Development Services to look again at the highest and best use of the land. I expect it'll take a little longer than a few months, but it is definitely on our radar, and we do have some funds set aside within the CD budget for refreshing the feasibility study that was carried out in 2015 or 16.
Okay, thank you. Follow up, Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Yes, so the timelines on the OCP. So we're going through the OCP upgrade. Where approximately is this scheduled for that? The whole west side, just order of magnitude. When do we anticipate to be addressing the OCP in that part?
Any comment on that, Ms. Wade?
Yes, Your Worship, through to Councillor Palmer, it is part of the overall process that we have to look at with natural assets and land inventory, where we're working closely with Director Braun on the land inventory and the need for economic strategy and who we're attracting, and land investment as well as housing supply. So it's comprehensive, and we hope to have, as we go through these studies, it'll be in the fall, that we'll be looking at this and bringing it back for discussion.
Thank you, and thank you, Mayor Sulz. Mayor Sulz, on the section 7, there's a gravel pit, I think it's proposed, or it might be about to start, I'm not sure the exact status, right adjacent, just to the west of this proposed pit. And my understanding is that used to be in section 17, and I think that might have been in your tenure. Was there a section that was removed, part of this section 17, that the city authorized a removal from that part just adjacent?
I don't recall any removal from a section 17. Ms. Braun, any comment? Do you recall or have anything in records that we've removed something from section 17? Now I see Ms. Wade has just raised her hand. Do you have information? Go ahead.
I would like to follow up on that question. I know there's been discussion that a former council did remove a section of it for use as a gravel pit without realizing that there had been this larger section 17 imposed on it, but that goes back in time, and I'd want to clarify and go back through the past reports and make sure that we have the timeline for you. I think it is worth having a timeline laid out for you and some understanding of what was looked at in the past and where we are in present day with this. There's a lot of moving parts, and I do think it's worth a future report that provides you with that background information.
Okay, I'd appreciate that, because if it was with my tenure, I don't recall it. So I'd like to see a timeline on that. Ms. Wade, do you have further comment on that?
Yeah, through to your worship, just a point of clarification. I am aware, in going through the history of these files, that there was, this was originally a section 16, and there is a section of the lands that were removed for a gravel pit and taken out of the section 16, and then it became a section 17, which was partly due to changes in provincial legislation as well.
Okay, all right.
And I just want to note that this really isn't related to this file at hand that we are discussing.
Yep, appreciate that. All right, another follow-up, Councillor Palmer, before I go to another councillor?
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. I do think it's related because it's in the same area, and it's just understanding how we go ahead in the future. And I think that I'm supportive of the motion that's there. I think it's an important one. Yet, as has been noted by the director, that there is requirement for aggregates and there's a need for gravel. My understanding, and I don't have the facts, but that there's something like 22 pits on that side of the river, not all within the city boundaries, but in adjacent areas. And there's been several. And I think that is so important for us to have started identifying, okay, where's the appropriate use? It seems to me gravel pits have been applications. We're hearing about them on a regular basis, and they seem to be very ad hoc. And I think this is a good move to start to address that. I'm glad that the feasibility study's done so that we can understand the best use for that land for the community. Thank you, Mayor Sulz.
Great, thank you. Councillor Elliott, you have something to comment on this presentation.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just how tied are we to a technology park? I mean, we've had a discussion about a recreational area or a park on the other side of the road. Maybe the whole area from there's a climbing rec site, BC rec site is just before the bridge. It could be incorporated into the path that goes up on the left side of the Jordan River and add in the right and make the whole thing a community recreation site. Dog park, all kinds of things that could be done. If we put section 17 technology park, does that limit us? Are we tied to that? Could we create something else?
Well, it might be nice to keep something so we actually have some lands for technology. But Ms. Braun, you have your hands up.
From my understanding, and again, I would like to have some time to go back into the files and read previous reports. There had been two different areas of land. One was right by the dam, one was south of the dam in the proposed area. And initial ideas were proposing something like a server farm as part of a tech park. And from my understanding, that may not be the highest and best use. I think this was 10, 15 years ago that this was being considered. And while they may create some jobs, the economic multiplier is not what it could be in terms of sustainable economic growth. And I think there are many other uses that we're seeing now as as our tourism economy develops, that we need to go back and look at that feasibility study, what we do need for technology growth, what we do need as a highest and best use. And some of those answers will come out of our tech strategy that we're implementing right now around the fabrication lab we're building on site to identify as an incubator where we may need to grow in the future and where the best place would be to do that, to accommodate that growth.
Great.
Oh,
go ahead. No, go ahead, Councillor.
So the picture that's on our screen right now it's very close in. The sites you're talking about are further past the dump, past the heli operations that are along the road. This one we're addressing is closer in, closer to the bridge. Is that right, Marianne, or am I right there, Gary, or not?
Yeah, I believe so. Ms. Braun, do you want to weigh in just total?
I believe so, but again, I would like to come back with a fully nuanced report as to what was done in the past, what our options are now, what the highest and best uses may be, and I think that is part appropriately of the OCP review. But there is a history there, and I want to make sure we have the facts straight before I present that information to council.
Okay, great.
And may I ask one more?
Yes.
Just if it's section 17, just end it at that rather than add tech park to it. Are we able to do that?
I believe the section 17 designation means that there could be many different uses that apply, which is the problem we're having right now, is that many different industrial uses can apply under section 17, which is why we're receiving applications for gravel pit expansions. But Director Wade would be the best one to answer that question.
Okay. All right, so we've got the motion on the table for refusal of the application, and I want to vote on that. Is there any further comment? Councillor Palmer, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Yeah, I appreciate the comments from Director Braun and Director Wade on both the OCP and then the use of that land. I spent several hours over the weekend through that gravel pit all the way to the north. So there's multiple gravel pits through there. The city has a gravel pit. There's the landfill operations that are moving gravel. There's plenty of residual old gravel pits that have since been grown over with forestry. And so the history when this was brought into the city, I think had to do with when the dam came in a number of years ago. And yet we haven't really solidly addressed what we're doing for this big chunk of land. And so I think it's really great that it's been highlighted to this level and just is amplifying the importance of addressing aggregates, land use, all those things. If we can get to that sort of comprehensive view of what we're doing with the lands on that side, so we can resolve a lot of these conflicts. I appreciate the comments about the changing economy of the tourism. There's a section along that whole area on what's on the screen right now of beautiful. When I say beautiful, I think it's a beautiful little unofficial trail that goes along the river, the Columbia River, that's fairly well used and has viewscapes, and I just see that part, being part of this comprehensive view that Councillor Elliott was talking about as well. So I look forward to that report that Director Braun was looking at the whole history, and then so that we can really sink our teeth into this and making sure that the OCP, when we have that updated in the fall, is very, very solid view of where we're going as the community. And my last comment is that whole area, I'm not sure exactly, but order of magnitude is about 20% of the land area of Revelstoke. So it's very, very important for us to address that. Thank you, Mayor Sulz.
Thank you, Councillor. Any further comment, Ms. Braun or Ms. Wade, before I call a question?
I think Ms. Wade had a comment beforehand, but then I would like to add one more comment.
Okay, Ms. Wade.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to say that since Director Braun and I have been here, which is just barely over 2 years, we've been very aware of this issue and been working together to have the tools that are necessary for us to, one, protect the natural environment, two, figure out the economic development strategies for these lands that will meet Director Braun's long-term vision for economic strategy, and that we can, as a intermediate step, which Director Braun and I have discussed, is modify the current Section 17 to say what we don't want to see and more what we want to see, which will then help us with these gravel pit referrals that would come in front country. Because if we say that we were not entertaining gravel pits in this area of the Section 17, then that is something that the province would look at when it comes into front country BC. So Director Braun and I are working very closely on this to adjust and try to mitigate the old Section 17 so it better suits the environment we're in today.
Okay. Thank you for that comment. Ms. Braun.
Through Your Worship, what she said, and I would also add that what was visioned as economic growth engines 10 years ago has changed substantially, and our focus on developing recreational trails, leveraging our resort municipality initiative money to implement a resort development strategy, working with our regional partners on backcountry recreation access and land use are all newer pieces that will inform our strategy going forward. So I agree with Director Wade, we need to define what can't go in there so that we can leave open our options for what may come down the road in 10 years from now, which may be different again. So I think we need to, again, look at the highest and best use, review our technology needs, and review our recreation sector needs as well before we identify our options.
All right. Councillor Palmer, one last comment.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. So just further, again, I concur with those comments. I would also like to acknowledge the public that has highlighted the concerns about the use of gravel pits on that side of the river. This was brought to attention, almost 2 years ago by the public. A lot of public concerns, and then again more recently expressed fairly strongly. And I think that's really helped us motivate us as a council to make sure that we get this highlighted and make sure that it stays as a high priority for making sure that we have appropriate land use on that side. Thank you, Mayor Sulz.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to now call a question on item 11C1. That is basically refusal of the application. All those in favor of the refusal of the application? Opposed? It is passed unanimously. Thank you, Council. Item 2, someone want to put the feasibility study, please, on Councillor Brooks Hill?
That the province be informed that a feasibility study is underway for the development of these lands for a technology park and associated uses.
Okay, seconder for that motion, please. Councillor Charlotte. Any further discussion on the feasibility study that is already underway? Councillor Elliott, you have your hand up. You're muted.
Just regarding the associated uses, could we add recreation site or area, a number of different things besides the tech park?
Well, I think that associated uses could be just about anything. So I'm okay with this. I'm concerned about legislation, and we've already got this on the table. And it is already moved and seconded. So I would like to just leave it as is. I think the associated uses will be whatever comes up that's needed for our community. Is that not correct, Ms. Braun?
That's correct. Associated uses could mean things we haven't even defined yet, but the work that we want to do on our recreation and tourism economy and on our future tech needs will help identify what associated uses could look like.
Okay.
So, if I could add, I mean, if I were reading that technology park and associated uses, I would say associated uses with technology, but that's semantics. But I think you should find or appropriate use for our community.
Okay. All right. Any further comments or questions on the motion on the table? All those in favor? Motion's carried unanimously. Thank you. We're going to move on to industrial property nuisance complaints. Before we do, I just want to take a 2-minute break just for washroom. And now I need to get my councillors back here because the screen's been shared. Councillor Brooks Hill, you had your hand up. Do you need to make a comment?
I was going to ask for a bathroom break. You're reading my mind.
That's what we're doing right now. All right. So we're going to leave the cameras on. We're just going to go to the washroom here shortly, and then we'll be back. Thank you. Okay, do we have council and staff back? So we're going to go on to Development Services, Industrial Park Nuisance Complaint 606 Victoria Road. I'm going to ask if Mr. Simon, if you have any comments or a presentation before we start.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship. I can give a really brief high-level overview for council before delving into this one, if that's okay.
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, so just again, brief high-level overview. Staff received a development permit in the M1 zoning for forming character of industrial buildings. So as stated previously, development permits regulate the forming character, especially within this particular area. It is with respect to commercial industrial development permit area C as specified in the official community plan. And that is what this application was ultimately evaluated against. The value of construction with this application was less than $100,000. Therefore, in accordance with council bylaws, specifically the delegation bylaw, the decision to render or the ability to render a decision on this development permit is delegated to the Director of Development Services. The bylaw does not allow for this ability to render a decision as the delegate to anyone else. So it is only the Director of Development Services who is able to issue these permits as per the bylaw. So the process that this entails for what we kind of call a minor development permit, these are ones, again, that council does not see. Their value is under $100,000. That is what's specified in the delegation bylaw. They do not go to Advisory Planning Commission as per the Advisory Planning Commission bylaw. Staff do prepare a minor report, kind of a memo internally to outline whether or not the application does comply with the applicable development permit area guidelines as contained within the OCP, which is what we are required to evaluate them against. And in this particular circumstance, it was found to comply with those development permit area guidelines for area C, being the commercial industrial development permit area. And as such, the development permit was issued for the forming character of the building. A building permit was also issued. This mainly really had to do with the integrity of the structures and making sure that it was overseen by a reputable professional. The owners have since undertaken permitted uses on the site in accordance with the M1 zoning. Specifically, the ones that we will be discussing today is the general contractor yard, as well as light manufacturing. These are permitted uses within the zone, along with a multitude of other uses that you can undertake, as they are available to be undertaken in accordance with the permitted uses of the M1 zone. Concerns were raised from adjacent landowners. This did date back to April 22nd, which is when the initial C-Click fix complaint came in. The C-Click fix complaint was responded to on April 23rd. Staff have gone back and forth multiple times with the owner-operator of the site, have worked with them as well as listened to the concerns of adjacent neighbors, and have worked to ensure that all development is undertaken in accordance with city bylaws. Specifically in this case would be the noise control bylaw, as well as the conditions of use in the M1 zone of the zoning bylaw. So there's been multiple site inspections, multiple phone conversations. There's been people that have come to the counter that staff have been speaking to. And the biggest thing that I really want council and the community to be aware of is that staff have been quite accessible for members of the public who have had questions or concerns about the development. And we have been in contact just about every day or every other day with the owner-operator of the site in an effort to mitigate these concerns beyond the minimum requirements of our bylaw. So that's kind of a really brief high-level overview. Again, this is a situation where the appropriate permits were issued. They were issued in accordance with our city bylaws. And now after the permits for the forming character of the development have been issued, there are concerns that are raised with respect to other activities that are occurring on site. And staff have been listening to those concerns and working with the owner operator of the site to again go above and beyond the minimum bylaw requirements in an effort to mitigate those impacts on surrounding residential properties. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'm definitely able to try and answer them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Simon. So my understanding in this is that the operators on the site have gone to the neighborhood twice with letters stating what they're doing. My understanding is even as of today, they're continuing to work on sound mitigation, applying new products inside that area of construction so that the sound will be lessened. And so I know that they've been talking with the community. Community's been talking with some of the councillors, and definitely has raised some concerns with council and with the community regarding noise. We've received a small petition that's in our package here of 58 signatures of the local neighbors. I'm one of the neighbors who's a little further distant and did hear early on noise, but have since not heard noise. Some of us have driven by, some of us have gone down and sat just to listen to the noise. And we've heard a bit of noise, sometimes we've heard no noise, but because this is a concern with the neighborhood, definitely there's some concerns here with councillors. So I'm going to ask if there's councillors that want to make comment at this point, because some of the councillors were the ones who were asking for this to be put on the table. Anyone want to speak up? Councillor Charlotte, you have your hand up, and Councillor Palmer.
Okay. Yeah, I am curious to hear from my fellow councillors as well. I think this is an interesting conversation around both this complaint and issue, but also the potential for further issues with old zoning that is incompatible with the current use of the area. I think we've discussed this before in the OCP process, especially when it comes to environmental concerns. And here we have an example of a social concern. I have a few questions, but I'm happy to pass it forward to my fellow councillors here to get a broad perspective here. I've been trying to look at the different aspects of this, because to me, this is where expectations were set, whether intentionally or not. The residents expected storage, from what I've heard, where now we have light industrial manufacturing work going on. And as we go through our zoning bylaw updates and our building bylaw updates, and I really appreciate Director Marianne Wade's comments around clarifying definitions, so that it is not left up for interpretation, but it is clearly defined. In our noise bylaw, I noticed that it refers to an authorized person who would enforce and administer the bylaw and would then be deciding what is unreasonably loud or excessive. We live in a town with a mill in city limits, with railroad tracks coming through town, with all sorts of different sources of noise. And I'm wondering why there were no, because the noise bylaw was last done in 2009. And I find it interesting, there's no clear definition of what excessive noise looks like. And I'm curious as to whether there's any insight on why there is no decibel level definition of this. And just for perspective, because I have the railroad tracks outside of my building, I need to use noise canceling headphones on a regular basis, so I can empathize with the challenges. But we need to be able to agree as neighbors that there is a certain level we're just going to have to live with. But how do we define that so it's not up for interpretation?
Okay. Any comments, Mr. Simon?
Through your worship, Councillor Charlotte, yes, controlling noise is very challenging. It is also a subjective and a very personal matter, right? What is excessive noise to one person may not be considered excessive noise to another. I can't comment back in 2009 as to why specific decibel levels were not in place back then, but I can comment that with respect to, I just want to make sure it's very clear for all of council as well as members of the public. We can have debates, discussions all day long about our specific bylaws, about where we need to update them, our conditions of use in our industrial zones, the uses that are permitted in our industrial zones, our development permit area guidelines. Staff are currently in the planning group, I can confirm, engaged in those comprehensive community planning projects that take substantial time. we need to be able to have that conversation separate from applications that are submitted in accordance with current bylaws that staff have the obligation and the responsibility to process as per those bylaws. So I just want to make sure that we have that distinction, because again, you know, when any individual application comes in, not necessarily the time to argue the merits of our current bylaws, but by all means, staff are well aware of some of the items that we would be seeking to update with respect to those comprehensive planning projects.
Thank you. Your Worship, if I could ask a follow-up?
Yes.
Then if I could just ask, and I was trying to comb through all the reports and find the details, but I am curious as to how this was administered in this case then, please.
So for this particular case, through your worship, I do understand, again, it was a complaint-based system where neighbors had concerns about the excessive noise level. Staff had gone out for several site inspections, had called the owner immediately when there were concerns that were raised about the noise. You know, we don't have a tool to go out and measure the decibel levels. I know our bylaw enforcement team had been out to ensure that they were compliant with the hours of operation in the noise control bylaw. City staff from development services have been out multiple times now, and again, as stated, have been engaged in discussions with the owner operator. On May 6th, I believe they had finished installation of soundproofing barriers within the building itself to further mitigate the noise. We've been in conversations with them to see whether or not there's an appetite to reduce hours of operation, specifically with respect to the use of the air guns, which is what a lot of neighboring residents had indicated was the major concern. And the owner operator has been quite amicable with that. The idea was that they would not be using the air guns before 8 a.m. And I believe, and again, I'm not going to speak for the owner operator here, but I do believe that they had sent out letters affirming that they would be doing it between 8 and 5. We've also spoken with them about even further reduced hours on Fridays, again, to further mitigate the concerns. So I can appreciate the concerns from council and from the neighbors. And I hope that there's some understanding in terms of the challenges that staff have with respect to administering these provisions of the bylaw when there's not specific measurable parameters for us to go and point to. And we need to rely on both the concerns that are coming in from the residents, making sure that they're meaningfully addressed, and working with the business owner operators to look for a solution that involves voluntary compliance. And I would say in this particular circumstance, in my opinion, that staff have been quite diligent at listening to the concerns of residents and have been very diligent at being responsive in working with the owner operator to try and address those concerns in what we would deem to be a meaningful way that tries to balance the rights of property owners, where they can develop in accordance with city bylaws, and the concerns of adjacent residents. And just one last thing, I know I like to go on a lot sometimes, but staff are fully aware of the context of the situation. We have an old property that's zoned industrial, has had a multitude of uses over time, and now has been vacant for some time, surrounded by residential. We 100% appreciate and acknowledge that the threshold to cause a nuisance in this area when you're surrounded by residential is greater than if you're surrounded by industrial development out in the Big Eddy or out on West Side Road. So staff are well aware of that, and that is why we have been trying so diligently to work with the owner to listen to what the neighbors are saying and to try and institute measures to mitigate those impacts.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. I'll be clear right from the beginning. I have over 30 years of experience in local government, and I absolutely respect Mr. Simons and the quality of his reports that I've seen. I think there's great work, and so I want to make sure that we don't get into a councillor staff debate. I'm going to provide some comments from my perspective as a councillor. With a background of experience. Bottom line at the end, I think we have a duty of fairness, just in general. There's a duty of fairness, an obligation, and I do not believe that the residents in that area have been treated fairly with the development. I think it's unfortunate also with the developer that we've got down to a point that has become really, really messy. Mayor Sulz, I do have a question for you first. On the complaint, I think one of the communication errors that's happened is the complaints. I learned about this about 2 weeks ago. One of my other councillors, I think, learned about a week ago. I understand that another councillor flagged you back when we did the photo op at the City Hall. When were you aware, Mayor Sulz, of the complaints? And I'm just wondering why this wasn't communicated to council of the magnitude of this. I believe the complaints are very warranted, and I think they're concerning. But I think I just want to start with that, so I have an understanding where you're at. And just in a little bit of context, there was a request for a special meeting. Here we're going to have a very long meeting. There was a request by councillors to have a special meeting on this to address it directly. And because I see that as a councillor, that this has got magnified to such a big area that we need to have a lot of spend more time. This is not, as you stated, a few people that are complaining. This is the entire neighborhood that is complaining, and I think they have valid complaints. So when did you become aware of this?
Yeah, probably 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, Mr. Simon and I had some concern. I definitely had received either an email or saw a see-click fix regarding the issue. I live not far away in this neighborhood, and one morning I heard it, so I came into the office and discussed it with Mr. Simon. You talk about a photo op that was outside and that there was some issues at that point. I was not aware of issues with this property at that point. It was just a couple weeks ago that I first heard that there was complaints. So, and why wasn't that communicated to council? I was discussing with staff what they were doing. They told me their format, and they were discussing it with the proponent, and the proponent was discussing it with the neighborhood. So I thought that was the appropriate issue or the appropriate way to deal with it. And I was satisfied that staff had that well in hand, felt that they were doing what they could with the proponent. They were lending an ear to the neighbors who were calling in. And that's where we were at with my involvement. Now you want to talk about council. You had asked me on a Friday afternoon for a meeting on Monday afternoon that we were going to meet again here on Tuesday. I thought this was appropriate to bring it all into one meeting. We have staff here. They're able to answer questions and give input rather than calling a special meeting. So that was my thought on that.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. So a question to Mr. Simon on this. One of the concerns that I have for you, because I from my perspective, I kind of feel because you've done the report here on the complaint, but from what I saw in the documentation that I've seen, that it doesn't look like that you were necessarily involved on this particular project from the onset. And I'm just sort of, I'm assuming that you're comfortable, you're speaking very confidently on this project, and just what's your relationship with the project, so I have an understanding.
Through your worship to Councillor Palmer, all work that comes out of the planning department here is a group effort, is a team effort. We correspond with each other, we collaborate with each other. I would say that while from a leadership perspective, our leaders are excellent in terms of, being the ones to get behind the final decision and stand up to that decision. I would say that we have a very collaborative mentality, and that since the onset, when this came in and there was inquiries at the front counter from the current owner regarding how they could develop on the site and what the current uses were that were permitted, that I had spoken with them about, to the application coming in the door, to me speaking with other staff about the application who were responsible for reviewing it. It is a group dynamic in the department here, and it is a collaborative mentality that we bring to these decisions that ultimately come out of the department. So I have no issue speaking towards this application or any applications that do come out of this department, whether previous or future, with respect to those decisions that are made.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. Thank again, Mayor Sulz. So some specific questions. This I certainly think as far as a minor variance, we can talk about the $100,000 threshold, and the CAO has said, well, we can change the bylaw. I think the intent of the bylaw, because it talks about signage, really minor things, and that the intent behind the $100,000 threshold, the intent is something that isn't of this magnitude. So the first question I have is the determination of the value of $70,000. How was that determined? What's the mechanism that the city uses for that? Because from my perspective, the feel is that this is a much bigger than a $70,000 project. So I'm just wondering how that number was determined.
Through your worship to Councillor Palmer, it's identified on the application when the applicant does provide it to us. And I will note again for council, I understand that there is a multitude of activities that are occurring on this site, some of them being outdoor storage, some of them more relating to general contractor uses that are on site. The value of construction is specifically associated with the building itself, because that is what the development permit is ultimately issued for. But I would also note, through your worship to Councillor Palmer, with respect to the delegation bylaw that we are responsible for administering and enforcing, it does not have a specific measure in there as to how that $100,000 is ultimately calculated. So there's an option to include that on the application form. And if there are any concerns from staff, then we would be working with the owner towards the validity of those numbers.
Mayor Sulz, was the validity of the 70,000, was it ever questioned at all, or was it accepted then?
You mean, did I accept?
No, through to Mr. Simon, yeah.
Go ahead and answer, Mr. Simon, and then I have other councillors that have questions too, Councillor Palmer.
Through your worship to Councillor Palmer, in this particular case, they are shipping container structures. So when we look at the construction value of shipping containers, that would be a solid marker to use in accordance with what we would deem to be best practices, right? But again, I would note that there is no specific mechanism in the delegation bylaw which specifies how that $100,000 is intended to be calculated. I would note that staff have a evaluation schedule that's applicable to building permits that we could potentially use, but again, it's not specified in the delegation bylaw how to specifically calculate that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Notwithstanding our procedure bylaw and ability to speak to this, I'm quite happy to let the other councillors speak to it, and I'll come back later on.
Councillor Brooksville, you have a question.
Yes, thank you. I've a couple of questions. I'm still a little bit confused, but I'm starting to it's getting more clear exactly this process. There hasn't really been any industrial projects that have come to council while I've been here, or really for the last couple of years. So this is a little bit new to me. I'm curious, I've read through the M1, M2, and M3 zoning, and the works that are going on at Victoria there, I'm not sure that I'm in agreement that that's light manufacturing. But I understand it's vague. I'm just wondering how, given the vagueness of the bylaw, how do you determine that this indeed is light manufacturing?
Through your worship to Councillor Brooks Hill. So when staff are administering a zoning bylaw, one of the key things, and one of the other council members, I believe was Councillor Gillette, touched upon it, definitions are absolutely critical so that you get rid of that ambiguity in terms of what the intended use is actually entailing. So in this particular circumstance, there are some uses that are not defined in the bylaw, such as contractor yard, and what planning case law essentially dictates then is you would need to go to the commonly understood interpreted definition of that use. So one of the key things that is very critical for staff, because again, I appreciate the question, and I want to make sure that we are separating this application and comprehensive zoning bylaw reviews. One of the key things that staff are doing, though, with our zoning bylaw update is including definitions for all these uses to help further demonstrate how they are intended to be interpreted and applied to the zones. So I can appreciate the concerns from residents that, you know, they might view some activities that are included in the M1 zone as not particularly constituting light industrial. But as staff, you know, that's something we can talk about as part of a comprehensive zoning bylaw review. But when it comes to an application that is submitted, we have to go what the bylaw says and what's available as a use as of today.
Okay, because, you know, I read it and there's like a special clause in the bylaw to do with a specific property that allows milling operations limited to log house and construction. And so, you know, if you look at M2, it specifically says no planer mills, whereas my understanding is that they're on this property planing a lot of things. So it's starting to seem much more to me like an M2 or an M3 use. And so you're saying that there's sort of standardized terminology for planners that exist. So when light manufacturing, there is somewhere in there that says manufacturing like prefab homes type of things.
So through your worship to Councillor Brooks Hill, again, I'm just trying to understand, I guess what you're asking, if they are undertaking a use that is not permitted in that zone, how staff would follow up with that, or how we would be interpreting that. Because I understand that there would be some overlap between the uses in the M1, M2, M3 zone. And, you know, when we don't have definitions for some of these uses, the interpretation of it, you know, really can be challenging, I guess, for residents to understand. Is that, I'm just trying to understand, I guess, what your question is.
What my question is? Well, I'm trying to understand how you, the planning staff, have determined that light manufacturing can mean this type of like prefabbing of, I'm not sure the specific term, but prefabbing houses or buildings.
Yeah, so through your worship, I mean, they're undertaking activities that involve an air gun when staff have been on site. Those are the activities that are being undertaken. That's what's been indicated to us as occurring on site, and concerns from the adjacent neighbors indicate that the use of the air gun is specifically what is the major concern. If we want to classify that type of activity as general industrial or heavy industrial activities, you know, that causes quite a challenge. That's quite a common piece of equipment that one would use in home renovations, right? So I understand that it's being used in this case to do some prefab manufacturing, but the equipment that's actually being used is something that would be, you know, constituting light mechanical equipment or very, very light scale of equipment. So those are the concerns. If there are, you know, more heavy industrial activities such as milling and planing that are occurring on site, this would be the first that staff are being made aware of that occurring on site. And we have, again, completed multiple site inspections and been in contact with the owner operator, as well as neighbors over the past 2 weeks now and 3 weeks. And the major concerns that have been brought to our attention is with respect to the air guns. And when we've been on site, that's what we have observed as well. So I'm not too sure about the planing and milling, but I would say, in my professional opinion, when I am on site, with respect to the activities that they are undertaking, I am seeing outdoor storage. I am seeing the use of an air gun to build trusses. And if that is the only piece of equipment that is being used, I would characterize that as light manufacturing. Ideally, if we can get it inside a building to, you know, attenuate the sound, then that would be ideal. And staff have been working with the owner on that.
So thank you for that explanation. So my next question is a little bit different. I'm just trying to understand this. So if one were to buy a piece of property that's zoned industrial, what would be the process if I wanted to start manufacturing things? So do I need a building to start working? Or, you know, if I was, say, manufacturing trusses, obviously you don't really need a building to do that. That can be done outdoors. Do I just need, if it's in theory zoned for it, like I just need a business license and that's about it? Or
Yeah, through your worship, essentially, if you buy a piece of property and there is a permitted use, the onus is on an applicant to tell us what they are applying for in accordance with the permitted uses of the zone, give us details on what they are pursuing. Staff would evaluate that and then determine whether or not that use is appropriate in the zone. But I would note in the M1 industrial zone, there's nothing that I have come across that indicates all activities need to take place within a building. So again, we need to enforce and regulate development through the bylaw as it currently sits today. The discussion about how to improve our bylaws and changes that we want to see as a community is one that we look forward to having and that we are currently engaged in, but that needs to be had separate from the matter that's before us today, which is with respect to a particular application.
Okay. I notice other councillors have their hands up, so I'll yield the floor for now, but thank you.
Okay, Councillor Charlotte.
Thank you, Your Worship. A comment that I had heard recently around the site was around parking and how the staff of the site were apparently using parking throughout the neighborhood, including in back alleys, on the streets. I was looking at the zoning and looking for what are the regulations for parking spaces required. It looks like 1 per 2 employees as a total of 2 shifts. And I'm curious as to how that is defined and how it was applied in this particular case.
Through your worship to Councillor Chalette, I'd have to double check the actual specific zoning bylaw regulations, but I would note that, again, staff have been working with the owner to address the off-street parking implications or the on-street parking implications, and the owner has indicated that they're in the process of clearing the site because, again, one of the key things we've been looking at is no outdoor storage within the front or side yard setbacks as per the conditions of the M1 zone. And within that area, they will have a dedicated parking parking spots for all of the employees. And there should be no need for on-street parking. And I would note that the off-street parking requirements would be evaluated as part of the application. Our industrial parking requirements, you know, they're a mixture of employees on shift, and they are a mixture of different types of buildings. I will say that the interpretation and application of our parking regulations is one of the key focuses that staff are working on right now as part of our zoning bylaw review, because of the challenges that it has that we've encountered for a multitude of sites throughout the city. So again, you know, 1 per 2 employees. Staff would be working with the owner to understand how many employees are there in the business, how many people we can expect on a day-to-day basis, and then making sure that we have the minimum parking requirements. And with the issued development permit, the site plan did identify parking spots that, based on the proposal at the time, would have satisfied the zoning bylaw requirements. If the use on site changes again, then that's something that staff would work with the owner to make sure that with that changing use, there are sufficient parking stalls as per the zoning bylaw.
Wonderful. So if I could just ask a follow-up on that.
Yes.
So the parking stalls that were on the permit identified as needed through that process, those are currently in existence, or they are working to create those?
So through your worship, when staff have been on site, again, we've seen cars that were parked on the side, cars that were parked on the opposite side of the fence, and cars that were parked inside the fence. We were working with them to get a dedicated parking space located inside the boundaries of the fence to further screen that area and again reduce those aesthetic impacts. You know, staff are hoping that if that space has not already been developed and dedicated, because we were out there for a site inspection on May 3rd, that it will be imminently, and we will be going out to site again very, very shortly to follow up from that site inspection.
Wonderful, thank you. Parking is a challenge all over this silly city. So I appreciate that is also up for grabs for clarifying and making it easier to follow for us all. It's important for us to understand what these rules are so that we can figure out how to agree to live together. Thank you.
Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Yeah, so a number of comments were made, a few points just on some of the comments that were just made. One on case law. I don't think any of us are lawyers here. However, there is some principles of what a reasonable person would do, that reasonable person test. And also I'll be disagreeing with staff, but a reasonable person would not say this is light industrial. So but I do have some questions. So under the development permit process, and even as a quote minor, which I question that for sure, was there a requirement for assessment? These are just things that could have been done, and it's not clear in my mind. Some of the things that could have been required, and so this is for me to have a better understanding what did, but recognizing that my understanding is the application was for a storage building for that specific use, and that the development permit was issued on the basis of that information. And I understand that staff is saying that they can change the use and that it's not binding within the permit. I question that, but that's not the question here. It's just whether these things were done. So was there a requirement, did the manager require an assessment of compatibility with the proposed OCP and zoning bylaw? So so we'll talk about the zoning bylaw. We know what applies to that particular parcel, but there's also that there can be a requirement for assessment to the OCP. And I was just wondering if that was done.
So through your worship to Councillor Palmer, and I think this is a point of clarification that is very important for all council members to understand. Under the Local Government Act, as staff, when we get a development permit, that development permit can only be reviewed against the applicable development permit area guidelines. This was a development permit for forming character of the building. Is there a reference to a storage building in the permit? Yes, it is. It is for context, so that there is information about what the permit was attempting to facilitate the construction of. But I would note that the development permit does not regulate use. It regulates the forming character of the building. And when staff are evaluating that development permit and applying subsequent conditions to that development permit and requiring items from the owner for that development permit, it has to be directly related to those development permit area guidelines. And within the development permit area guidelines, there is no specific requirement for an evaluation against the OCP. The uses that are permitted on the site are permitted, and the owner had submitted a development permit for the forming character of a building to facilitate those uses on site.
So Mayor Sulz, just for clarity where I'm coming from, I believe that this is not just a NIMBYism of the local area. This is the type of building that we do not envision for our community. And so if the legacy is, we've got the roundabout legacy of this council, and if you got the legacy of this particular building in this use that's surrounded by residential area, we are making some very, very serious mistakes. Having said that, in the bylaws, so the development approval procedures bylaw, as I received off the city's website, so I'm assuming it's up to date. It says, without limiting the generality of the foregoing, the manager may require additional information. I recognize that the use is determined by the zoning, and I question whether this is light industrial. I don't believe it is, and I don't believe a reasonable person would say this is light, especially when you take, and it's layered, the M1, M2, M3, getting all the way up to crushing. What's that in between thing? I think a reasonable person looking at the various things would say this is M2, and we can disagree on that. but it says without limit can require these things. So, the question that I'm, based on what Mr. Simons is saying, is this bylaw absolutely wrong? And I recognize the definitions and the problems of definitions, and that's a very, very common problem in bylaws all over the place. And this highlights the importance of those definitions. And I think we really need to expedite some of those things. Having said that, the assessment of with the OCP can be done, can be required according to our bylaw. An assessment of the compatibility of the project with adjacent land uses. The adjacent land uses is residential, and so was that required? And I think that probably the answer is the same thing, that we can't do it for use. However, the bylaw indicates that the manager can require it and then have better contextual understanding of this. I'll just state the other ones that are in the bylaw. So requirement of traffic impact analysis. Again, just further to some of the other comments regarding the parking, the development permit has identified those parking spaces. I think there's 13. I think a number of them are being used for storage right now. So is that in breach of the bylaw? It's just a question out there. I don't think the manager can require a noise impact analysis. Of course, the application was saying it's going to be storage, so that it would be reasonable that that wasn't requested because the applicant said this is going to be for storage, and that's creating a part of this problem. And this is a big problem because I think the residents all have a reasonable complaint. I don't believe this is fair for them, and so now it's got exasperated to this level. I do not believe that this council, if it had come to council, would have accepted this development application. So those are just a few comments on that. We've talked about the development permit. Again, the use, I don't need to go more into a difference of opinion on that, but the manufacturing versus storage, the parking obstructed by materials, the landscaping requirements. Doing the comparison to other developments, because this is the other inconsistency that I'm seeing, is we've required this high level of onus to say, for example, the A&W, I believe that their occupancy was delayed because of the landscaping things. But meanwhile, we have this use, there's a question out there, do they have occupancy aspect? The exterior finish, I don't think that is what our community envisioned for our, and we do, in comparison, we have a concrete plant with gravel in M3 that just came to council earlier today, a beautiful building, and nobody's going to ever see it. But it's, because of the length of distance, that report was really good. It was really helpful for us to understand. And I think that applicant went way over and above the requirements for that. And it's just a comparison. Is there occupancy on this? Is there an occupancy infraction? I do have one other question, specifically on the Ministry of Environment Certificate of Compliance. That wasn't in our package, but I've received it from a third party. In that, assuming this information is correct, I believe it is, it says in there, future building on site must be built with a concrete foundation and concrete slab. And so I don't know the answer, but what is it on a concrete slab?
Through your worship to Councillor Palmer. So to answer your first question, no, it's a temporary building. Staff have followed up with MOE officials and they have confirmed that it would not be required to meet that requirement of the COC because it is a temporary shipping container building. And that is one thing that I do want to highlight as well. The owner has worked with staff with respect to their future development plans, and they do have a plan to ultimately develop the property in accordance with the land use that has been assigned to it in the official community plan. So the owner is hoping within the next 2 to 3 years to get that process underway and to get construction going and to pursue a rezoning of the property to get it in line with that land use that is identified in the OCP that we would evaluate those rezoning applications against. So I can appreciate the comments and concerns from Councillor Palmer, with respect to the development procedures bylaw, and when a rezoning application comes in, we will be looking again at how we get it in line with the OCP and what parameters within that development procedures bylaw we asked for to ensure that there's no impact on adjacent properties. This is a temporary building, is how it has been explained to staff and how it has been applied for. And the buildings themselves are shipping containers, and they are in line with the certificate of compliance based on all the correspondence that we have had with Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. And again, they are temporary.
So, Mayor Sulz, I see Councillor Ryan is, but I do have at least one final point to make beyond this, but I'll let Councillor Ryan go ahead.
Okay, Councillor Ryan, you have a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that to Councillor Palmer's point about the building not being the right type of building, I think the point that misses is obviously this is, and it's just not an ideal location, but this type of use is necessary, and these are good local contractors that do a lot of important work here, and so it's, I think it's not the best thing to just dismiss it as a building that we don't want anywhere. It's just obviously not an ideal location. I'm curious from staff's perspective why the issue wouldn't have been flagged initially, and not considering, I mean, of course, the delegation bylaw doesn't require it to go to council, but is it not typical for staff to identify potential issues that might come about and just say, you know what, in this case, even though it's under $100,000, maybe we would issue this to council so that we can get their feedback, or to have a little bit more due diligence, like that noise impact analysis. I'm curious what the thought process was there.
Through your worship to Councillor Ryan, the delegation bylaw does not allow the authority to be redelegated. It does not have provisions that allow for this to go back to council at the discretion of staff. I will note, and this is kind of about the whole functioning of the development services group. We work from the bottom up. We get inquiries, we get complaints, we get current planning applications. Those are all really, really key for us. Those are priority. Those are what we work on the day-to-day basis. And I don't expect all of council or the public to know what we do on a day-to-day basis. We're happy to chat with them about it. But with respect to amending our bylaws, completing our community planning projects to improve our bylaws, those are things that staff are in the process of doing, and we do actually have some tweaks to our delegation bylaw that is in draft form. But again, it's a matter of resource capacity and being able to bring these things to council. So to your point, Councillor Ryan, it is something that staff would like to look at in our development procedures bylaw, so that we do have a little bit more flexibility in how to deal with some of these delegated applications.
So just to make sure I'm understanding it correctly, there's actually no legislative way that would allow staff to recommend this application to council for their input?
Through your worship, there's nothing in the development procedures bylaw that would allow this to refer this back to council.
Even if it was just for comment and not for approval?
Through your worship, again, we as staff, we follow our bylaws as they are currently adopted. We can have discussions all day long about how to improve those bylaws, but when an application comes in, it's not for staff to say these bylaws are not right for your particular application. Therefore, we're going to put that aside and put it on hold until staff have the ability to go through and propose amendments and bring them before council, so that we make sure everyone's okay. There would be significant operational challenges with getting permits in and out of the department if that was the case for each time an application came in that warranted some potential re-examining of the bylaws.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, at this point, I really don't know, like, what are the options, right? Like, even if this is a 2 to 3 year thing, there's obviously lots of noise, and there's a daycare nearby and all kinds of people being negatively impacted. Like, where does that leave us? This is, it's not pretty.
Yeah, through your worship, Councillor Ryan, is that a question to me in terms of what options?
Yeah, it's a question to anybody who's got any ideas.
So through your worship, I mean, permits were issued in accordance with city bylaws. Staff will continue to listen with the neighbors and work with the owner to try and mitigate the concerns to ensure that there is adherence to the conditions of use in the M1 zone, adherence to the noise control bylaw. I will say in this particular circumstance, the owner has been very agreeable to working with staff and the neighbors. So again, that's staff are looking towards working with the community to find a solution to meaningfully address their concerns that have been raised for this and find a way that these developments can coexist to ensure that the impacts of an industrial zone that's surrounded by residential property are mitigated appropriately. And we will continue to do that if concerns are raised from adjacent neighbors. We are hoping that the concerns and the complaints that are registered against this property continue to diminish as we work with the owner, as we listen to the community to try and address those concerns.
And if they don't?
Through your worship, then if there are non-compliances noted in the bylaw, then staff would have the ability to issue tickets for infractions associated with the bylaws, and staff would be working with our bylaw enforcement team to do that. At this point, again, when our bylaw enforcement team has been out there, our planning staff have been out there, and while I don't have the authority to issue a ticket, again, I can work with our staff that can, and every time that I've been on site, I have not noted any bylaw infractions other than, you know, outdoor storage being located in the front yard, and working with the owner to get the property in compliance with those conditions of use, which is staff's process for any bylaw enforcement matter. It's an education process. It is a process to listen and hear what the concerns are and to work with a property owner to address those concerns. That is the overall intent.
Right. Okay, thanks.
Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. One question. So on the temporary use, because there was confusion early on, including for me, so that we have this temporary use permit process, which this was not. And I haven't dug into what I would see as the temporary use kind of entitlement for people and so can you just describe on the temporary use and from your perspective why they were able to put a temporary building that their intention is years as per their letter. We're talking years, and that certainly does not feel temporary to me. I don't think it feels temporary to the residents either. So if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Through your worship, Councillor Palmer, we currently don't have a definition of temporary within the zoning bylaw. But again, this is based on what the applicant has identified as their long-term development plans for the property. And again, to give some context that this is not intended to be a permanent building that will be there for the foreseeable future. It is in line with the Ministry of Environment's view as well with respect to certificate of compliance adherence, where any permanent building needs to be constructed on that permanent foundation, as you had indicated previously, and staff would continue to work with the owner to do so. With respect to a temporary use permit, you are correct. That is a separate process, and you know, for staff, we're happy to answer questions if people have concerns or require clarification about a temporary use permit versus a development permit that's issued for what is being described to staff as a temporary building. So in terms of this particular circumstance, that's where we fall. It's a development permit for what is described as a temporary building. A temporary use permit actually has to do with pursuing a use that is not permitted within a zone, and all temporary use permits to facilitate that type of activity need to go to council for review. So this is case, it is not a temporary use permit, just to be very clear. It is a development permit for what is described as a temporary building. Again, it can be subjective about what constitutes a temporary building. Is it 30 days, a year, 2 years? But I think the idea in this circumstance was for the owner to inform staff and the neighborhood that the long-term development plans, you know, looking 2 to 3 years out, would be to pursue a high-quality residential or potentially mixed-use building that would be more compatible and in line with the surrounding neighborhood, which is what's envisioned for in the OCP, and which is what staff would be looking to support with any rezoning application that would ultimately come before council.
So Mayor Sulz, just on the temporary use, there's a certain point where temporary is no longer temporary, and I think that's a concern, a very, very valid concern of the residents. It's a very valid concern that I have, and I think it's a concern that council should have. I'm concerned that when we look at this, there was a number of loopholes that were found, and cumulatively we're doing something that's wrong. And so we talked this temporary thing. So if it went through a temporary use permit, which I have problems with, but that's a separate subject, the temporary, this idea of temporary use, and I think that it possibly could have been stopped on that basis. And then certainly if it wasn't, if we're talking years, which the applicant is saying years now in a public letter, then that is no longer temporary. Now, we'll be talking about legal implications in the closed session, but I think that there is significant risk that the city is facing. I'm also concerned, Mayor Sulz, about kind of a groupthink within the planning department, because there's just so many of these things that just would not. That's not what we've been experiencing. We've been, the development community has been experiencing, what they consider very, very onerous processes. And this one just seems to have, it's just gone through just like that. We've got this temporary use. If it was on a concrete foundation, for sure, we're over the $100,000 right away. And so I'm concerned about that. I hope that the planning department, after this discussion, that you can stop and say, okay, are we making errors? Are we making errors? Because if there's, and say, have we been a little bit too liberal on the interpretations of these sort of gray areas, the use, the temporary aspect of it, the delegation based on $100,000 thing, and so these are just they're not necessarily questions. They're more that I hope the planning department says, okay, well, maybe there is that this cumulatively there is a problem here, and just further on that in the requirements for the manager on looking at that, there is procedures of ensuring that the form and character is in keeping, and this is not something that I think would have been approved before. So I think there's a breach of fairness from my perspective. I think there's a breach on the use. I think that there is bylaws that are being broken, and so there's just this big quagmire, and we're doing a disservice to the city. Now, I might be wrong. I'm one voice. I'm taking it from a political perspective based on experience. I think there is more matters, and I think we'll be talking more about those in the closed session.
All right, thanks, Councillor Palmer. Mr. Simon, I'm going to get you to weigh in at this point, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. A few things I just want to note. I would not describe the development process here as onerous. I would say, in my experience here over the last 15, 16 months, staff within this group have done an absolutely remarkable job at working with the community and working to streamline our procedures and to try and get through these applications while making sure they are in line with city bylaws in a respectable time frame. I would also note too, I want to make sure that council is not confusing a temporary use permit for a use that would not be listed within the zone that someone wants to undertake, and what someone is describing as a temporary building that is being issued a development permit. This is not a temporary use permit that is issued on site. That is a separate process. That is a separate permit. That is a separate, is regulated separately under our bylaws and under the legislation. This is a development permit for form and character that needs to be evaluated against the development permit area guidelines as they're currently written in our official community plan, which is exactly what staff had done, and staff had followed bylaws to ultimately issue this permit. Again, we have multiple, what we refer to as minor development permits for replacing decks within riparian areas that as per our procedures bylaw, are delegated to staff to ultimately issue a decision on, so that they don't have to go to advisory planning commission and they don't have to go to council for a decision to be rendered. Staff are following the bylaws as they are currently written to ultimately render decisions on these permits. I just want to make that very, very clear. We can have discussions with council and with the community about how to improve our bylaws, but currently staff have to follow the bylaws as they are written. We have an obligation to do so. As a planner, we have an obligation to our profession to follow the bylaws as they are currently written and process permits accordingly.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Simon. Councillor Brookshill.
Thank you. Yeah, I can appreciate that Mr. Simon's approach to development permits, but also the bylaws in general. And clearly our bylaw needs to be changed. I feel, just as a general thing, I feel that staff should have the discretion to take a minor development permit to council if they feel there's a good reason. Not having that discretion seems like an oversight. I just wanted to say I'm not sure how to frame this exactly, but reading the conditions of use to not be an annoyance or nuisance for reason of et cetera, noise, and then reading our noise bylaw and the specific standards they have and exceptions for construction, for building construction, leads me to believe that building construction, air guns are very loud. And there's that exception for building a house because people need to build houses and it's temporary. People with air guns I had someone build next door to me a few years ago and they were using air guns and it lasted for a month or two and it would be a few hours a day. Whereas this project is using air guns frequently 5 or 6 days a week for years. That is an annoyance or a nuisance. And clearly the petition from the neighborhood has shown that it's an annoyance or a nuisance. So I really hope that the proponents can mitigate this noise to a level, because, if you're building this stuff inside, like there's a big difference when they're building next door, when they're putting on the sheets of plywood on the outside or when they're nailing in studs on the inside. And so I don't think that this temporary building is adequate as it stands for this use that they're undertaking, but hopefully some sort of mitigation can happen. My concern at that point is that then it should be a DP because the building they put for the use they wanted was inadequate for what they wanted. And I am concerned about that sort of standard being acceptable in this town, that you put in an application for something small, you make it bigger, and you can get away with it and get around some of the maybe not onerous bylaws, but that more in-depth oversight that comes with a larger project as opposed to a smaller one.
Mr. Simon.
Through your worship, Councillor Brookshill, thank you. I definitely appreciate the comments there. I would note, April 22nd is when this was originally brought to staff's concern towards the end of the day. It was responded to on April 23rd, and since April 23rd, staff have been working with the owner specifically to address that specific condition of use that does not cause a nuisance or annoyance. And again, staff will acknowledge, and I think the community can acknowledge there, that the threshold to cause a nuisance or annoyance is greater because it is residential. But staff's focus is on enforcing these regulations that are in the zoning bylaw, which I think everyone who reads them will have a bit of a different take about what that threshold for nuisance and annoyance is. So that's the challenge that staff find themselves in when we are enforcing these. But the key is to listen to the community. They have outlined several concerns, and then to work with the owners to try and find a way to meaningfully address them. And in this particular case, again, it's been looking at further soundproofing of the building, as well as adjusting hours of operation specifically with respect to the use of that air gun.
Thank you, Mr. Simon. Councillor Elliott.
Yeah. Thank you, Your Worship. I'd like to reiterate what Mike said. I think the use that was proposed was a storage place with some assembly as a construction entity, but what's turned out is more manufacturing. And manufacturing and the noise levels associated with that, the air guns are the problem. I'm sure there's dust and parking and all that, but the biggest issue is the noise. And maybe I don't know what the proponent has proposed on noise reduction. Are they trying to enclose the building? And I mean, it's open on both sides, so that's probably the reason why this is so loud there. But I'm just curious.
Mr. Simon, any comment? I will make a comment at the end, but I'm going to reserve my my comment to the very last. Do you want any comment?
Yeah, through your worship to Councillor Elliott again. With respect to the noise, the biggest things we can do, the hours of operation. That's a major key point. Staff have been working with them on that to go above and beyond the noise control bylaw requirements. They have gotten it 4 days a week and then reduced hours on Friday. So on the weekends, there should be no activities occurring on site. And then as well as further soundproofing of that building. I know that the operator there has been quite keen to research best practices and the best use of materials to further mitigate the noise impacts. Which again, staff are working with them to find ways to address the concerns that have been raised by the community in a timely manner.
I would just think that no one anticipated 2 years of air gunning next to a residential area. So that, to me, that's such a stretch from what would be acceptable. And I can understand the neighborhood. I can understand the tension that's involved, especially after a year last year with they went through the inconvenience of the traffic circle and all the construction that's been going on in their neighborhood for the last little while. So it just exacerbated the whole issue in that area.
All right, thank you. Any further comments from councillors before we move on? Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. I won't go over the stuff again, but I will just talk about the consultation process. I disagree that this, I strongly suspect that this was not a minor development permit process. However, even if it was, the manager has the full authority that council would have on applying that. And one of them is in the bylaw is as determined by staff and approved by council, the level of consultation required in relation to an application is determined by the statutory requirements, its complexity and possible impacts. And so as such, applications can be referred to external agencies, organizations, and city committees. So there was in the committee of the whole is a committee of council that probably was an appropriate place in hindsight, definitely in hindsight now, to have flagged that to council so we could have had a more robust conversation. Also, if there is restrictions on the bylaw, my understanding anyways, further to Mr. Simon, as to what you can and cannot do, council is also restricted by the bylaws. And so if that was the case of what Mr. Simons is saying, what the planning department is saying, we would have had the equal restriction on us as council. And so we still would have been in this mess if that was true. I don't believe it's true. I think there is all these others, but I've gone through that before, and we'll have further dialogue in the in-camera session.
All right, any other comments from other councillors? So as Mr. Simon has said many times during this conversation, he has had conversation with the proponents. They have had conversation with some of the neighbors. And my comment to the owner this morning was this is an issue that he needs to deal with the neighborhood and actually has to figure out a way to mitigate the issues. He's willing to do that. He's been working with Mr. Simon and our development services department to deal with that. Even today, they were looking at different ways to help mitigate noise. We need to make sure that they are a good neighbor, and we've been talking about that for a long time, even on previous councils. So they're working within their confines to do whatever they can to come up with a good neighbor. The fact that we're here now means that it didn't happen soon enough. And so they will work with that. Staff will monitor it, and we'll see how we can come out to make sure that the issue is dealt with. Because these are metal containers, they reverberate the sound. They have put up doors on one side that open and close. They may have to do that on the other. Whatever they need to do, they're actually looking at it. They are doing work for the community. They're building components for our low-cost housing project. Having said that, that doesn't mean that we can't be bad neighbors or that we're allowed to be bad neighbors. So they're doing what they can do, and we'll actually monitor that. Staff will monitor that as we move forward. So I want to thank you for your time and for bringing this issue up. We're now going to move on.
Your Worship.
Yes.
Through your worship, I think it's important for council to recognize that there's been a bit of an attack on the planning department, the development services department, and I think it's important that the public realizes that the planning department has done nothing wrong. They followed council bylaws. They've done what they are legally obliged to do. So this attack from council on staff is completely unwarranted, and I think that the public should be aware of that. And I'm surprised that other council members have not stood up for staff with respect to this. This needs to be brought out, that you don't attack a department and say they're doing something wrong and council would have done something different when they are following a council bylaw. I think that needs to be said.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. And so I'll bring clarity because I'm probably the strongest voice and going the hardest here. I'm being very careful on saying about interpretation and having a different perspective on that. I reckon, and I've thought about this before, talking about it before, but I actually agree 100% with Mr. Simons on the minor development permit process. I actually don't even think that the bylaw is broken. I think it's appropriate. And now there's interpretation on different things, and there's a difference, and that's why I'm asking the planning department to really consider about how much groupthink is happening there. We do not want all these little things coming to council. We'll get buried so fast. We'll get buried so fast if we have every complaint. There is so many NIMBY complaints out there. I tell you, council does not want all those. I think that this is an exception there, and that's why it's got highlighted to this level. I have accountability. My accountability is to the electorate as a politician. I think I agree with the staff on the planning department. We now have a very robust, I believe, a very robust planning department. I believe that we have good people, good reports, and I'm trying to articulate those things, and I'm super appreciative of the clarity. They're some of the best reports I've seen. I remember the first one that came up was Ms. Hartling, and very, very clear options that really helped the council decision. This is not, from my perspective at all, an attack on the planning department. This is a big issue, and I think by the size of it and the magnitude, that yes, there's something that's significantly broken, and we need to address it. I think we do have exposure, and that needs to be addressed. There's different interpretation. We'll talk about those things, but I want to make it very, very clear that this is not an attack at all on the planning department. This is a mess. And I know how difficult it is dealing with difficult citizens. And sometimes we can, at that staff level, start to see the public as when you have that coming, unreasonable things, because even some of the complaints that are coming through, I talked to some of the other councillors about, there's going to be concerns that a lot of the complaints that aren't necessarily relevant. And we need to listen to that as council. We need to listen to that, and even staff, to let people vent. But then what's the real core issue? And I think that's what we're really struggling with here. I do appreciate the CEO's comments on that. And if there's any sort of sense whatsoever of my strength in having very strong opinions, I appreciate that and apologize if there's any kind of sense that they felt that a personal attack. But we're really looking at this process in interpretation. Thank you, Mary Sulz.
All right, thank you, Councillor. Thank you, councillors. Thank you, Ms. Lowe, for your comment. Definitely, I will be paying more attention to how things are interpreted around this table. I want to move on now to the correspondence, the Nordic Ski Club funding request, EOF. Ms. Braun, do you want to weigh in on this, and or how do you feel?
Yes, Your Honor. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, just to say that generally the process is that applications to the Economic Opportunity Fund are vetted or brought forward to Council by Economic Development to ensure that it aligns with our economic development strategy. In this case, the Nordic Centre has grown in both its membership and the physical infrastructure over the past several years, and has demonstrated its value to our visitor attraction and to our community. We invested RMI funds in the grooming equipment last year, as well as a pilot project to provide shuttle service to the Nordic Centre, as well as a lot of previous substantial investment. This aligns with our destination development plan and our ECDEV strategy, and we strongly support that this application be recommended to the CSRD for their approval.
Right, thank you. All right, so can I get a motion on the table, please? Councillor Brookshill.
That the allocation of economic opportunity funds to the Revelstoke Nordic Ski Club in the amount of $20,000 towards the purchase of a tractor backhoe be endorsed.
Seconder for the motion, please. Councillor Elliott. Any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? You have a question, Councillor Palmer? Or are you just putting your hand up to endorse?
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. I just like to acknowledge just the amazing work that the Nordic Ski Club has been doing. We are now, I think, probably the premier place for Nordic skiing in the province. I don't know absolutely, but I've been in that whole culture there for many years in the past, and it's just absolutely amazing, and the work that the volunteers have been doing with the Nordic Club. So I'd just like to really acknowledge that and thank staff for working on this grant application.
Great. All right, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Motion's carried unanimous. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Braun. I appreciate your input. And this will go forward to the CSRD. Communications, Environmental Advisory Committee minutes of January 28th and April 22nd. Do you have any comments, Councillor Charlotte, on those meetings?
I wrote them down. Sorry, my notes are all getting buried here. No. Sorry, asking about the dog food. EAC meetings. So one of the things that I'm keeping an eye on is the 6-month check-in on whether or not we get the funding for the first step in the study for the Backcountry Recreation Access Plan. That was back in the January meeting that we were presented with the overview of that from Director Braun. I'm excited to see where that goes. And the liquid waste management plan was presented to the environmental committee. We had a really good discussion around it. And in the interest of communication as the councillor on the committee and back and forth, if there's any questions that council would like to hear discussed by the environmental committee, I would love to hear them.
Great, thank you. Any comments from other councillors for Councillor Charlotte? Councillor Elliott? Councillor Elliott, go ahead.
Yep, yeah. Just the compost facility, when is it due to come online? Do you, is that something that the environmental committee would be chasing?
It was presented to the committee, so from my understanding is it is expected to come online this summer. It will be for commercial purposes first, I think is the focus. And we did start discussing what were the options for local pickup. And I believe we are expecting a report back from city staff at our, I don't know if it's at our next meeting or at a future date. I don't want to peg a time on that, but I know we are expecting to hear back some more options. But there were some really good questions brought up and some ideas presented from other communities.
And so I guess aligned with that is, does the environmental committee feel we need to get a more powerful environmental person on staff, on city staff?
In what capacity, Councillor Elliott?
Well, we've just our environmental coordinator, the contract position that we've had for the last year or so has moved on. So could we find something better or find something a better arrangement to make this thing work?
Ms. Lowe, are we not entertaining some sort of funding so that we can hire another environmental coordinator?
Through your worship, I don't believe, is that in the minutes? Are we talking about the environmental coordinator? Okay.
No, it's just.
So it would be something that we would bring forward, Councillor Elliott, at a different meeting with respect to looking at some grant funding through BC Hydro to help us with CARIB reporting through the OCP. So that will be included in a different meeting, in a different report.
Perfect. Thank you for that comment.
Well, actually, I'd like to, I'm trying to get something more productive in the environmental coordinator here, because we've had that position, really didn't get much out of it as far as I can see. But maybe some input from the environmental committee, what they would like.
Okay, Councillor Charlotte, if you could just weigh in, and then we're going to move on because this isn't in the minutes.
No, not at all. And I think the environmental committee was quite impressed with the amount of work that our climate change coordinator had accomplished. It's a lot of moving parts. So having those finished pieces, I know there were quite a few documents and reports she played a big role in that I think progressed really nicely. And I think that's more of a budget conversation rather than the EAC conversation in my mind. Just because to find the funding and the budgeting, but I agree. I think it's outside the scope of this particular discussion around the EAC nets.
Great, thank you. Councillor Palmer, you have a comment on the minutes?
Thank you, Mayor Sulz. Yes, regarding the minutes and the proceedings of the meeting, as indicated in the minutes, one of the things I would like to see with the Environmental Committee and other committees, let's talk about the Environmental Committee, is more specific recommendations coming to council. So in the form of a resolution, that would be really, really helpful for us as a council. So with having that dialogue that has that advisory, having very, very clear recommendations coming back to council.
Yeah. And if I could,
yes.
On the April minutes, it does say that we will be further discussing the liquid waste management plan at our next meeting in May. And the goal is to send a recommendation to council. So that's what I was actually asking for, if any questions from council regarding the liquid waste management plan, particularly, because we had a good fulsome discussion, but I just want to make sure that we're addressing any concerns that council may have at this point.
Okay.
But it can come up further later as well.
All right. Anything further, councillors? Seeing nothing, all right, we're going to move on. Thank you again, Councillor Charlotte, for your involvement with this committee. Staff, do we have any questions from the press?
No, we haven't received anything, Your Worship.
Okay, so we're going to move on. So I'd like to move in camera pursuant to section 90.1 E and L of the Community Charter. If somebody want to make that motion for me, please. Councillor Charlotte, seconded by Councillor Brooks Hill. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. We're going to move in camera. We'll take a 5-minute break before we go in camera. Thank you.
I'm going to go do some stretching.